Chapter 1132. Elodie's expression changed when he felt his sword pierce through it made him feel as though he was trying to slice through a wall of sludge, and his reaction to it was forced to be delayed. Once again, Elodie felt like all the force in his strike was dissipated. The first time he had assumed that it was an ability of Lionel's armor, but this time his sword hadn't even grazed it. It suddenly made him understand that Lionel was forcefully dispersing the force attached to his blade, something that left him at a shock. The combination of dream rupture, duality domain, withering snowfall, and Lionel's divine armor's spatial domain made Elodie feel as though all his most powerful strikes were landing on a bed of cotton. Lionel had too many abilities that could siphon away and disperse force. It forced Elodie into using more and more force to compensate, but that only drained his stamina faster. The instant Elodie turned this into a battle of techniques, he found himself countered at every turn. He could feel that his actual strength wasn't far off from Lionel. In fact, in terms of raw ability, he was a step or two above. But Lionel's ability to calculate a step or two ahead of him and respond perfectly resulted in him getting pushed further and further into a corner. Bang! 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 Elodie brandished his sword in one hand, his other drawing a circle in the air. A ring of blinding white gold formed in the blink of an eye as he parried Lionel's piercing spear strike. The ring of white gold shot downward, landing perfectly in the spot Lionel's foot would land next. Elodie's timing was perfect. Everything about Lionel's momentum said that he wouldn't be able to dodge in time. However, the land in the middle of the ring suddenly shot upward, giving Lionel a place to rest his foot. Elodie's free hand squeezed closed, shattering the small pillar of earth, but completely missing the target of Lionel's ankle. Right then, a blinding pair of wings stretching out for tens of meters spread to Lionel's back. Lionel knew that he couldn't allow his foot to fall to the ground, and could only activate his strongest movement technique. His body became as light as a feather, circulating instantaneously. With a light tap of his foot toward the crumbling rock pillar, Lionel vanished and appeared to Elodie's back. The shock amongst the spectators was palpable. Even as the crowd grew, drawn over by both the commotion and Lionel's earlier beam of light, there were likewise several members of the Speed Arm who were amongst them. However, even in the case that there wasn't a single member of the Luxnix main family that wouldn't recognize those illusory wings. Visit. For a better user experience, Elodie's pupils constricted into pinholes. He could feel the threat of danger creeping upon his neck, but he reacted just as quickly. A white gold ring shot out from the ground, catching Lionel somewhat off guard. At the same time, Elodie's sword pierced backward, his body twisting at an odd angle as he fell away from Lionel. Lionel's gaze sharpened. Elodie's white gold ring was too solid and simple to find a flaw, and dispersing the force that made it would take too much time. He finished these calculations in an instant, choosing to swing his spear downward. At the same time, another appeared before him, blocking the odd angle of Elodie's sword. Frustration began to mar Elodie's brow. He once again felt as though his sword had entered a sticky mud wall. Luckily, he was falling back now and could use his momentum to pull free, but this was already the fourth or fifth time. Elodie shot back, his body flipping and dodging as numerous golden droplets fell toward him like darts. His free hand remained active, drawing more and more white gold rings as he fell backward, only to send them flying forward toward Lionel. Bang! Lionel's spear shattered the white gold ring, his expression just as placid as always. Seeing the flood of them coming for him, his gaze flickered, the unmoving 9 radiant cores to his back jumping into action. A strong magnetic field repelled the rings, sending them spiraling backward as Lionel's figure flickered once more. Elodie's internal sight locked onto Lionel, who appeared to his back, but his heart shook in the next instant. Illusion. Elodie had fought too many battles with Eloquin to not sense the change. Surprisingly, though, Lionel's was even better than Eloquin's. Who was this man? Elodie's slightly delayed reaction didn't stop him from reacting in time. The billowing white gold fog around him surged, his thigh bulging as he planted it hard. He could feel the muscles in his legs tearing to shreds beneath the wild force, but just as quickly as they tore, they healed once more. Visit. For a better user experience using the sudden change in momentum, his sword pierced forward, his rings rebounding back from Lionel's repulsion and enveloping his 9 radiant cores. In one moment, it looked as though Elodie was piercing toward empty space. In the next, a flicker of starlight formed the outline of Lionel's body as the image to Elodie's back vanished into nothingness. Lionel's spear met Elodie's blade even as the former's radiant cores and the latter's ring clashed. Crush them. Elodie's gaze gave off a blinding light. His rings constricted, looking to shatter Lionel's radiant cores back into the benign force they came from. However, the result was far more explosive than he thought they would be. Boom. 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 Elodie felt as though his ears had popped as his eyes were filled with the searing image of blinding white lights. The only thing he could feel was the very familiar and annoying feeling of his sword slipping into a mud wall. But, this time, when he tried to pull back, his expression warped. Snap! Even amid all the loud cacophonic booms, as a swordsman, this noise was the most resounding of all. Even before he pulled back all the way, Elodie could feel the emptiness past the handle of his hilt. His sword was broken? In that moment, Elodie was completely disoriented. His hearing was nothing but high-pitched screeches, his gaze was filled with a blinding white light, and his internal sight was continuously being distorted by the wild magnetic fields pulsing and rebounding in the surroundings. The heat seared through his forced skin and his body felt like it was floating toward death. It was exactly at that moment that he felt the second clear feeling he had since the explosion. A piercing pain as his chest was skewered by the blade of a spear. Elodie coughed, a flood of blood riding down his chin and soaking his throat and chest. He had no idea how any of this had happened, but he vaguely felt that he had been painted into this corner. No, he had stepped into this trap with his arms wide open. Visit. For a better user experience, if Elodie had known better, he would have understood that the law Lionel chose for his S was the formation of an extremely thick and viscous corrosive semi-liquid. The more knowledge Lionel had on the law he chose, the easier it would be for him to use his king's might to project the law. With his ability, it took him a single glance to see through the flaws in craftsmanship Elodie's Tier 9 bronze sword had, and forcing it to collapse in on itself only took a few dips. Of course, understanding this would have done nothing for Elodie if he hadn't also understood that destroying Lionel's radiant cores was among the most foolish things he could have done. Elodie trembled and fell to his knees. The blasts cleared and the spectators were soon able to see the state of the battlefield. However, when they saw their armhead having fallen, and that the only thing holding him up was the blade running through his chest, they fell into a harsh and cold silence. Seeing the state of Elodie, Lionel didn't feel much of anything. No, that wasn't exactly right. He felt an emptiness wrought by the fact he felt like he had accomplished nothing. A seething rage was still bubbling within his heart and pulsing through his right hip. His wrist slightly trembled, causing Elodie to cough up another mouthful of blood. What is the meaning of this? Right at that moment, while Lionel's simmering rage was beginning to feel only more and more empty, a booming voice that could disperse the clouds and unsettle the wind fell. Numerous expressions changed as the aura of the current Luxnix family patriarch, Seath, caught all of their attention. To his back, numerous Viola family members followed. Lionel felt like he had locked onto a new target, his blood seething and the crimson in his eyes only growing deeper and more prominent. But it was then that he felt as though someone had pierced a hole through his heart. Everything he was feeling suddenly deflated in an instant. Aina? A resounding crack rang through Lionel's body. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. Completely out of his control, he raised his head and roared into the skies, his divine armor shattering into pieces and shooting away from his body. His face was revealed to the world, but all anyone could see were the countless crimson veins pulsing beneath his skin. The barrier to Tier 3 collapsed and Lionel's 7th star began to form. Chapter 1133. A blazing pillar of fire left Lionel's lips. To those of the Luxnix, it really felt as though the world might end at any time. Elodie, who was the closest to Lionel by far, took on a level of damage that could only be described as fatal. An entire layer of skin that faced Lionel burned off piece by piece, the shocking amount of pain snapping him out of his half-unconscious state. The devastation was difficult to grasp. Even Lionel's duality spear couldn't seem to withstand it at all. Seath's expression changed. He had no idea who Lionel was. Or, more accurately, he couldn't identify Lionel by his face alone. But, when he saw what was happening, even his own spine tingled. He was already well into the 6th dimension, and someone on Lionel's level should have been a matter of the flex of a single finger to deal with, but the force being projected out of his body right now filled Seath with so much fear that he froze for several seconds, his mind going completely blank. Under normal circumstances, Seath wouldn't even be here. It was only because Richard had come to communicate something with him that he had gone so far. Because Richard was now the crown heir of the Viola family, something only recently announced, there was an amount of face that Seath had to give him. In other families, Richard would have been entertained by their own crown heir, but unfortunately for Seath, the situation of the Luxniks was a bit unique. In every other situation, the patriarch had higher standing than the crown heir. But, in the Luxniks, it was the opposite. Miguel's standing was far beyond Seath's, and the former had the backing of both the Feather Sword Warriors and the Star Order Council. In the end, such a perfunctory job was left up to Seath. Visit. For a better user experience, when Seath snapped out of it, he realized just how terrible the situation was and immediately began giving out orders. Corner off this location. Don't allow anyone to enter this kilometer radius. Someone give me a briefing of what the hell happened right now. The moment after Seath said these words, he shot forward. He only had one goal in mind, to save Elodie. Because of the oddity of this generation, Elodie, Eloquin and Siller were an important balancing factor. Without them, Miguel's influence on this generation would be too strong. Though it was a bit naive of Seath to believe that just these three could match up to Miguel, he had no choice but to play the long game. The loss of even one of them would be far too much. He couldn't allow Elodie to die. Even if he didn't have such political implications to his thoughts, the Luxniks family couldn't just allow a genius to die for no reason. Seath didn't hold back, displaying the strength of a genius of the last generation. He used the 6th-dimensional movement techniques of the Luxniks with such skill that he managed to cover a kilometer distance in what felt like the blink of an eye. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, his force skin began to melt away piece by piece, withering away under the wall of heat emitting from Lionel. His expression couldn't help but change. He could tell that Lionel was just tier 3 of the 5th dimension. How could a youth so far beneath him possibly corrode his force skin? A murderous glint lit in Seath's gaze. He didn't know exactly what had happened here, but he didn't recognize Lionel, and just by his tan skin and hair color, he shouldn't be a member of the main branch. If Lionel could be controlled, it would be a boon for the Luxniks. But, seeing the carnage he caused here, how could things be so easy? Seath had every intention of killing Lionel where he stood until he felt something lock onto him. The danger was so profound that his steps almost faltered. The danger he felt from Lionel was more innate and instinctual, almost like what a child would feel toward the dark. But, it was still easy enough for one with a strong mind like Seath to bury this feeling and eventually get over it. But, this danger was completely different. It wasn't an irrational or instinctual fear. It was the kind of fear one felt when they ran into something they knew they couldn't overcome, the kind of fear that had to be learned through years of experience and training. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. Cold sweat drenched Seath from head to toe. He had no idea who was protecting Lionel in the shadows, but this experience was all he needed to know to understand just how vast the difference between them was. Seath appeared to Elodie's side. By now, the latter's face had practically entirely melted, his features becoming impossible to distinguish and pick out. If things continued, he really would have no chance or hope at surviving. Without hesitation, Seath pulled him away and charged out in a beam of light, cutting a straight path away from Lionel as fast as he could. The beam of fire emitting from Lionel only grew fiercer, his roar underlying it and trembling the hearts of all those who heard it. The clouds above completely dispersed and the ground shattered, large amounts of rocks beginning to melt and pool themselves into a larger and larger crater of lava. Waves of heat rippled into the surroundings. By the time Seath got back to where he had been, he realized that even without his orders, no one would have dared to enter the kilometer-wide radius. The heat was simply overwhelming, and even from so far away, many were still continuously moving back. The only ones that couldn't were the few stuck within Lionel's 4 pillars. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience crack. The duality spear finally couldn't take it any longer and completely collapsed, combusting from the inside out. Its pieces flew out in all directions, some even piercing directly into Lionel's body, and yet, he seemed so numb to it all that he didn't even notice. Chapter 1134. Lionel's body looked as though it might crack itself. Wild and raging red veins pulsed beneath his skin as his bones seemed to glow as though they were metals rising in temperature. Upon his chest, every beat of his heart was met by a pulse of red gold. It looked as though even his heart itself was overheating, filling up with lines of fire and magma. But there was no more prominent light than the one coming from his right hip. Surging tides of force rippled out again and again, the devastation only growing fiercer. The truth was that Lionel was a bit worried about things happening like this. But he had never expected to enter Tier 3 so quickly. By his previous progress, it should have taken over a year, at the very least. However, Lionel could have never imagined just the kind of impact would have on his progress, especially when combined with the secrets of his innate force node. When Lionel first learned he had an innate force node, he had randomly stumbled onto it. According to his calculations he completed, his body would only be perfectly whole if he completed a 10th node, despite the fact the cap the universe placed on everyone was 9. Being foolish and naive, Lionel went ahead and tried to form a 10th anyway, not having any idea that he would almost get himself killed. If not for the preparations his father had made and the plentiful nutrients hidden within his body from all of those vomit smoothies he was forced to chug, Lionel would have never made it so far in his journey. Visit. For a better user experience back then, Lionel had been all alone on terrain and could only ask the dictionary about his innate node. The trouble was that the dictionary had always been extremely specific with its answers. It never answered anything outside the scope of the questions Lionel posed to it, no matter how useful those answers would be. Lionel had asked the dictionary a very simple question. What abilities is Scarlet Star Force known for? And the dictionary had given him a very simple one-word answer: destruction. Soon after that, Lionel realized that there was someone driving a carriage over his hiding spot and he was forced to go out and check on what was happening. But, even if he hadn't been distracted, he could have never known just what kind of profound truths were hidden within this answer. Lionel had learned a lot about artistic conception and how they could breathe life into techniques and bolster one's strength. One of the most powerful abilities a person could have, the universal cycles, relied on a comprehension of artistic conception to draw in universal force to supplement your strength. Visit. For a better user experience ultimately, the artistic conception that the universal cycles were embodying was exactly that, the power of cycles and beauty of the dimensional versus karma. One thing would lead to the next and a perpetual cyclical construct could be formed. In the end, these cycles would give birth to universal force, one of the highest forms of force in all of existence and among one of the most enigmatic. How exactly did all of this relate to Scarlet Star Force? Well, it too represented a high form of energy. In fact, at least in human history, the importance of fire and the symbolism it carried was undeniable. Among all the elements, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that fire stood out amongst the rest. Through the lens of the human domain, there was no denying this. When things are put into this sort of perspective, just what sort of weight did the first-ranked fire elemental force hold? Destruction. Ironically, it was the antithesis of what human legends painted it out to be. So many painted it out to be a harbinger of life, a candle of innovation, a breath to a refreshing future. But Scarlet Star Force was anything but this. It was a force that embodied chaos, an elemental power that would burn all things to ash. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience, the fifth dimension was all about loosening the shackles the mind had on the body. In order to do this, techniques relied on visualization techniques to allow one to shed the mundane limits one subconsciously placed on themselves. Whether it was King's Might, and their fusion into the manifestation of Lionel's innate node, all of them were aspects of Lionel's consciousness. By choosing himself as the root artistic conception of his, Lionel had inadvertently added an indelible characteristic of destruction to his King's Might. In the vice versa, the implementation of Lionel's King's Might to project the will of his innate node had resulted in him subconsciously beginning to comprehend this Scarlet Star force which took his body on as a host. The result of these series of events were the preconceptions and misunderstandings in Lionel's mind being cleared one after another. The more he began to embody his true abilities and his true talents, the looser the chains that bound him became. At the same time, Lionel had no idea how lucky he was for two reasons in specific. First, if Lionel had completed this breakthrough on a fifth-dimensional world, not only he, but everyone on the planet would have died. Scarlet Star Force was something that even Seath, a Tier 7 sixth-dimensional expert, couldn't reliably counter for an extended period of time. How could a fifth-dimensional world possibly stand a chance? And second, had Lionel used the visualization of to reach Tier 3 instead of relying on his comprehension of his innate node to release the shackles on himself instead? The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. There was a 0% probability that he would have survived the formation of his seventh star. Without first grasping the artistic conception of destruction, how could his body, which couldn't even survive a split-second usage of Scarlet Star Force, possibly survive the formation of an entire star? Now, Lionel had a 10% probability of surviving. Chapter 1135. That's, Savon and Yuri looked toward one another, then toward Aina's back. But, ever since they had come here, Aina hadn't said a word. In truth, this was a bit odd for her current self. She had become very talkative after losing her personality, mostly because she didn't know the difference between thinking her thoughts and saying them out loud, so she just ended up saying whatever it was that was on her mind. However, it had already been several minutes since they reached this scene, but she hadn't commented on anything. When Savon and Yuri took a peek at her face, they once again found nothing. She stared toward the man roaring into the skies without even the slightest twinkle in her eye. If it were to be described, it was almost like she was sleeping or dreaming with her eyes open. The pair of girls looked toward one another again, but they were at a loss for what to say. They had already gotten used to one form of Aina's slow recovery, but this was completely new territory for them. This could get complicated. The two felt a flicker of complex emotions, their tiny fists tightening. They didn't know how these matters would end, but wasn't this the absolute worst time for Lionel to appear? And even under these circumstances. Richard mumbled something beneath his breath, his expression changing several times. He, of course, recognized Lionel. In fact, unlike the others, he was actually quite used to seeing force wildly fluctuating around him like this. He might have had a harder time if Lionel was in his normal state, ironically enough. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Is something the matter? Seath, who had been tending to Elodie before passing him on to others, frowned when he heard Richard. It would have been one thing if Richard was just reacting to the ridiculous nature of the situation, but Seath was far sharper than a fifth-dimensional boy would be. He could see a hint of recognition in Richard's eye. Do you know this boy? Seath pressed. Richard shook his head internally. He had gotten careless after so many years of vying for the crown heir position. He had been strung up so tight over the last several decades that the moment he got a chance to relax he became too loose. To think he would make such a rudimentary mistake. Yes, I do. Richard replied. He knew that it was a fool's errand to lie to a sixth-dimensional expert, especially when that expert was a Luxnix. Their internal sight was too strong and they were too good at picking up small little details. This was only more so for a patriarch like Seath who was embroiled in political games all day. Might I ask the young crown heir from where? Seath was greatly curious about this. He didn't expect that Richard would be familiar with Lionel. Of course, Richard had expected this much. The moment he made the mistake, he knew he would have to tell the entire story. Seath had just done him a great favor by accepting his proposal, so he couldn't just withhold such benign information from him. Visit. For the best know_vel_read_ng experience plus, Richard no longer had to keep the matters related to a secret since he had already secured his position. It was just a bit embarrassing. But then again, considering the state of Elodie, the embarrassment of Richard's loss was actually mitigated greatly. Savon and Yuri couldn't help but perk their ears up. They also found it hard to believe that Lionel would know Richard. The difference between their statuses should have been enormous. He was even a step above the arm heads of the Luxniks and technically on par with Miguel. Though, in practice, he was more so on par with the arm heads and dwarfed by Miguel. Yes. I met him in the Dimensional Cleanse trial zone. Seath's pupils constricted. He didn't need any more of an explanation. From Richard's tone and demeanor, it was clear he had lost. But, how could a branch family member possibly get their hands on a map to that trial zone? Seath suddenly felt like something was off about all of this. He had even noticed that Lionel had been wielding a high-quality quasi-silver spear before it was destroyed. This didn't even mention the fact he had practically wiped out half of the healing arm and even defeated Elodie. All of these things made it hard to reconcile these matters. In that moment, the situation suddenly changed. Lionel hacked up a mouthful of blood so crimson that it glowed like rubies. It almost felt as though this blood had come from the spring of his life force itself. But, just as quickly as it appeared, it was burnt to ash. Not even a moment later, Lionel's skin could no longer withstand the pressure, his veins burst and his body splintering. Fountains of lava-like blood flowed from him. Under the astonished gazes of those watching, Lionel's blood began to sizzle as it fell into the pools of lava around his feet. But, what was shocking was that it wasn't the lava causing the blood to sizzle and evaporate, it was instead Lionel's blood itself causing the lava to release screeching pillars of steam. Visit. For the best know_vel_read_ng experience the roaring pillar of flames that came from Lionel's mouth hung in the air, his roar finally waning. But, it was impossible to tell if this was because he was no longer in pain, or if it was just that his throat couldn't produce noise any longer. Steam billowed out from Lionel's mouth, his teeth glistening a pearly white beneath all the blood and fire. Sparks flew about with his every breath as though the air itself would ignite. Out of Lionel's control, two enormous illusory wings appeared to his back. They radiated a gorgeous white gold, and slowly but surely, they began to take form, just the slightest hint of crimson hidden within its gorgeously sculpted feathers. Lionel's head fell, going from tilted up to the skies to his chin resting on his chest. If not for the slight wheezing and coughing, not to mention the breaths of ash, it would be impossible to tell if he was still alive or not. It was then that his skin began to change once more. Scales of white gold erupted across his naked body. From far away, they seemed to be the scales of a white dragon. But, when one looked closer, it was possible to see that each individual scale was actually a small, miniaturized feather, outlined like a white seashell with veins of gold. Lionel had completed the second awakening of the healing branch and the third of the speed branch at the very same time. Every so often, a piece of his body would burst with blood, only to be quickly covered by these white scales once more. The cycle repeated again and again as though he was breathing. Glistening lava fell from his wings as his feet dangled in the skies. His body, toned to perfection, every outline of muscle and fiber displayed for all to see, didn't seem marred by the broken flesh and dripping blood in the slightest. Visit. For the best know_vel_read_ng experience at that moment, he truly looked like a fallen angel. Chapter 1136. Lionel could feel his body going through a wild number of changes. He felt it all now more than he ever had in the past, and he realized just how narrow his scope truly was. It wasn't that the snowy star owl lineage factor was weak, it was just that he never had the ability to bring out its full potential. First, he was lacking in the proper techniques to supplement it, and second, he had simply yet to fully unearth all of its secrets and fully awaken it all. This was when Lionel settled on a conclusion. The reason his metal synergy lineage factor felt so much more powerful was only a matter of relativity. How could a sixth-dimensional lineage factor ever match up to a seventh-dimensional one, especially when they could both be considered to be at the pinnacle of their respective levels? Simply put, maybe if Lionel entered the sixth dimension and began to interact with many talents on a similar level to himself, he would then begin to feel that even the Morales family's metal synergy lineage factor was weak as well, when in reality, he was also lacking the techniques to maximize its abilities. Right now, the potential Lionel had unearthed from his metal synergy lineage factor was limited to a hard body. But technically, was a technique left behind to him by his father. Aside from that, there was his divine armor. But once again, that was a technique left behind to him by his father. It was such a simple thing, but Lionel hadn't truly put things into perspective until just now. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. The Morales family lineage factor was called metal synergy. It wasn't called metal body lineage factor or divine armor lineage factor. Who knew how many more secrets were hidden within it that Lionel had never even touched upon? These matters put into perspective just how ridiculous Lionel was to think that he needed to improve his snowy star owl lineage factor right now, as though he was already at the end of his rope. Let alone being at the end of it. Lionel could just barely be considered to have grasped a piece of the first strands. Even if Lionel succeeded in mutating his snowy star owl lineage factor and built it upon a new force, it was very possible that even if this force was leagues beyond snow force, the overall power of his lineage factor might instead regress. Why? Because this new mutated lineage factor wouldn't have the countless millennia of refined techniques the Luxniks had built over their history. It would have to rely on Lionel to rebuild and modify it all from the ground up. It was possible that Lionel could be capable of this in the future. But, as things stood now, even with all his split minds, he was still lacking. As more of Lionel's potential was dug out by his evolving snowy star owl lineage factor, Lionel could feel more and more of its strength. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, the second awakening of the healing branch felt like a perpetual technique. Without allowing these feather-like scales to cover his body, Lionel's base healing factor had skyrocketed by more than tenfold. To put this into perspective, the base form of the mage art Lionel had self-created was only marginally better than Lionel's current base healing factor. Meaning, doing nothing was almost as good as casting, except it would cost Lionel almost no stamina at all, not to mention the fact it didn't require a cast time. If Lionel activated these feather-like scales and entered this sort of beast-like mode, his healing factor would increase several-fold more. By then, it would be a step better than casting the full mage art. As though this wasn't enough, Lionel felt that upon reaching this second awakening, his head evolved as well. In the past, it took several months for one use to recover. This time period varied so much that Lionel couldn't put a sure number on it. This was because in order to use, a certain amount of snow force had been absorbed and stored for a single burst use. But, as a baseline comparison, while on planet Luxnix, likely the densest region of snow force in this sector, it would take Lionel about 3 months to recover a single use of. Now, in this same environment, Lionel could feel that he only needed a single month to replenish his use of. In fact, Lionel had yet to recover from his last use, but the instant he completed his second awakening, it had been replenished. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Then, there was Lionel stepping into the third awakening of the snowy star owl speed branch. In truth, Lionel rarely used his speed branch in battle. The reason for this was quite simple. As calculative and scheming as he was, he wouldn't show an enemy his full abilities until he could force them into a corner with it. Speed was one of the largest factors in battle. In fact, Lionel felt that maybe the one thing no amount of calculation could overcome was indomitable speed. In addition, varying your attack speed made you a much more difficult opponent to handle than going full tilt from the very beginning. Lionel's slow, meticulous, and trap-setting approach to battle always left his speed branch by the wayside, but it had ironically been the first to reach its third awakening anyway. This was only a matter of fate. It had to be remembered that the snowy star owl was first and foremost known for its speed and wisdom. Healing was considered to be a secondary ability of its. Because the lineage factor was built on the back of snow force affinity, Lionel had a major leg up on the others of the Luxniks. Why was it that his snowy star owl lineage factor was leaps and bounds beyond the others? The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. The simple answer was that Lionel's light and star affinities were so high that snow force simply awakened to him naturally. In the end, it all linked back to the very same innate node that called his kidney home. Chapter 1137. Truthfully, all of these thoughts were simply running in the back of Lionel's mind. After 2 subsequent breakthroughs of the mind, Lionel's ability to split his attention had bloomed from just over 1,010,000 to a number approaching 5 million. Such a thing could only be said to be both a blessing and a curse. When he was battling, bathing in blood, bone and limbs, his mind was quite blank. All he cared about was calculating his next attack and making those before him suffer as much as possible. Rage colored his thoughts and took hold of his heart. There was only it and everything else was a sheet of white. But, when he saw her gaze, it felt like years of buried thoughts and feelings had all resurfaced at once. Something within him snapped and whatever had been leashed within him was released, ravaging his body like a wild beast. He could still see that gaze now. In fact, he could piece everything that made it up. No matter how much he tried to distract himself with just how much was going on in his body now, no matter how much he tried to focus on something else, to put his mind to something else, nothing worked. He could feel her gaze almost as though he was still looking into it. A hint of recognition, an odd curiosity, and then nothing. Her gaze didn't have any sadness, no remorse, no happiness, no glee. It was as though she was looking at the face of an acquaintance she had known long ago, a classmate that she remembered the look of and was mildly curious about just what they might be doing here. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel wished he didn't have the ability to analyze everything so thoroughly. He wished that he could believe that it was nonsense and that he had seen wrong, that his memory was fallible and maybe his brain was playing a trick on him, forcing him to see the worst. But, he knew that none of this true. As many minds as he had turned toward focusing on his body, he still had too many more left over. Each of them picking apart every angle, every expression, every minute detail. Let alone just her gaze, he could measure out the beat of her heart, the perspiration of her skin, the slant of her lips, the wrinkle of her nose. He could see the shift in her body, the angle of her arms, the position of her feet, the state of her hands. In just a split moment, he had gained hundreds of snapshots of each. Her posture was too unmoved, her breathing too even, her heart too steady. Her hands didn't clench, her gaze didn't tremble, and her feet didn't shift. Worst of all, her lips were just fine. How many times had he warned her not to bite those soft, pink lips of hers? And how many times had she ignored him? It was a habit she had built up over so many years. So long as she was biting them, Lionel was certain that something was wrong and he would have traveled through the gates of hell to make sure that she was okay. There was none of the characteristics of Aina he had come to know. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Lionel didn't feel rage, or anger. He just felt that the abyss that had been forming his gaze was now in his heart. It was a depth of emptiness he had never felt before, a level of nihilism he had never faced before. He had thought a lot about how this meeting after so long would go, but this was the last thing he had expected. Even indifference wasn't as bad as this. Maybe if she had been indifferent, then he could have concluded that she was still mad. But this wasn't that. Lionel's body descended into the pool of lava beneath him. The searing heat was practically like cool waters to his skin. It glided off of him and even his wounds without a sound as his swim pair of wings retracted in a flutter of falling feathers. 2 white gold rune marks appeared upon Lionel's back before slowly fading. An eerie sort of silence fell over everything, no one quite sure of what to do. Seath was especially indecisive. He was the only one that had felt that aura from earlier. There was nothing that had changed between then and now. He didn't believe that this hidden individual would suddenly allow him to kill Lionel now that his breakthrough was practically finished. Feathers of white gold began to fall from the skies. There wasn't a single Luxnix family member that didn't recognize this phenomenon. Though it was extraordinarily rare amongst fifth-dimensional existences, to the point where only two could do it, Elodie and Miguel, the same couldn't be said for the sixth-dimensional members of the Luxnix family. So, this was a sight that many had seen before, or at least heard about. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, it suddenly dawned on them all that Lionel was a master of several branches, something that made them all numb with shock. From the start of the phenomenon to the end, Lionel didn't move, his head still angled somewhat downward. It felt almost as though he was in his own world and couldn't be bothered with everything around him. This place. He didn't want to be here anymore. Lionel slowly stepped out the pool of lava, walking up the slope, apparently not aware of just how naked he was. He thought it was a shame that his duality spear was destroyed. It was probably the most useful and appropriate for his battle style among the quasi-silver spears. Though the spear domain ring was able to repair spears, this was clearly beyond its limits. There wasn't even a single piece left. Luckily, Lionel's divine armor was a symbiotic part of him. After using, it was already in perfect shape. The sadness and relief of these two matters didn't seem to move the needle for Lionel one way or another. Without a care for those around him, he simply walked toward the 4 pillars. Seath frowned. He didn't know what those pillars were, but he knew that if he allowed Lionel to walk into them, he would be gone. But, what could he possibly do? Were things really going to end like this? Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, more coming. Chapter 1138. Yuri and Savon looked toward one another, their expressions too complex to read. As surprised as everyone else was that Lionel was simply walking away, they were maybe even more so. Lionel was difficult to read. Despite the whirlwind of emotions going on his mind and heart, his face gave nothing away. The only hint of something was that his gaze was decidedly less cold. But, even this was only something they had gotten a brief look at when Lionel's gaze met Ana's. However, what neither of them expected was that Lionel would turn and leave without even trying to say anything to her. Their first reaction was that maybe Lionel was mad. They had lost count of the number of times that Ana had burst into a fit of tears, mumbling something about how much Lionel must hate her now. Of course, all of this occurred long before her personality had been reset to 0. This was a large part of the reason that Ana's father didn't want her to meet with Lionel. Ana was in a very sensitive time period right now, and meeting someone who might say vile things to her as a form of lashing out would be greatly detrimental to her. Things were especially bad because Ana was currently internalizing so much about Lionel right now, though she did so unconsciously. The reason she had chosen the path of absolute logic was only because in her own twisted way of viewing things, this was how she could connect with Lionel. Ironically, though, she didn't seem to take it to its logical conclusion. But, this was only because her memories of her last interaction with Lionel held her back. Those memories told her that being with Lionel had caused her a lot of grief. So, as unimpressed as she was with Richard, she still let him court her as he pleased. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Ana's priorities, as such, had become logic first. Then came her love of fighting, and finally it became growing strong. Those 3 things seemed benign, but when combined with someone who wanted to use reason even down to a fault, it could become very complicated, very quickly. Surprisingly, though, the harsh words and the fireworks they had expected from Lionel meeting Ana again simply didn't happen. Yuri and Savon also thought that it was possible that Lionel didn't want to implicate them in his troubles. In fact, the more they thought about it, the more it seemed that this made the most sense. But then, why was it that no one was moving? Shouldn't they be enraged by Lionel's actions? Shouldn't they be chasing him down now that the danger of his breakthrough had cleared? Why did it seem like they didn't dare to? Neither of them knew how to wrap their heads around this situation. They couldn't help but look toward Ana again, but she was still oddly silent. They couldn't grasp anything she was thinking. Of course, Seath was in an even worse position. He somehow felt like he was missing something important, something so important that it made his spine tingle. Suddenly, his gaze sharpened. Crown Heir Viola. What was the name of this young man? Richard blinked. He hadn't said his name on purpose. Visit. For a better user experience, though the matters surrounding Alianor's scandal had been pinned onto Gradier, his former fiercest competitor for the crown heir position, he still didn't want the Luxnix to drag up the truth of those matters. If he admitted that Lionel was, in fact, Lionel Morales, the very same Lionel Morales he had used to slander his mother, then it was possible for it to be drawn back to him. Richard frowned. But, now that Seath had asked, he truly couldn't avoid it. He was already the crown heir anyway, and it wasn't like the families were entirely buddy-buddy. Some underhanded schemes were inevitable. He said. His name is Lionel Morales. Richard didn't know what he expected from saying these words. But the reaction he got was so fierce that he almost coughed up blood. Seath's aura shot into the skies like a pillar, making it difficult for the fifth-dimensional existences around him to even stand properly, let alone breathe. Richard rapidly retreated, his expression flickering. He realized then that this was a bigger matter than he had initially thought, but how could it not be? This tidbit of information was actually what had allowed him to secure his crown heir position, and it was precisely it that buried his competition. The name Lionel Morales had been stricken from the Luxnix family records. In the history of the Luxnix, this had happened only a handful of times, and never to a child who couldn't even walk on his own at the time. How could there not be a big secret behind this? The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Halt. Seath's voice boomed for several kilometers. His palm flipped over, a badge of some sort appearing in his hands. The moment it did, he tossed it into the air. An enormous commotion broke loose, a pillar of blinding light shooting into the skies. The expressions of several changed, especially those of highest standing like the rankers and the division heads. That badge was the Patriarch's emblem. In terms of rank, it was only beneath the Star Order emblem. When it was deployed, it had the authority not only to deploy the Feather Sword Warriors, but the Star Order Council had the obligation to send representatives as well. With this emblem, the Patriarch essentially had 90% of the family's forces at their beck and call. Of course, the strongest forces were definitely those old monsters on the Star Order Council. But, in general situations, just a representative or two from them was enough to deal with most problems. It had been just over 2 decades since the last time the Patriarch's emblem was used. And now, it seemed to have been deployed again. Yet, inexplicably, as though he hadn't heard a single thing, Lionel continued to walk. Maybe the only change was that a pair of pants had appeared to cover his lower half. His placid expression made it seem as though he was entirely in his own world. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Chapter 1139. Seath wasn't a fool. As things stood now, he and the Patriarch's faction were in a precarious position. Of course, his chair on the Star Order Council was practically set in stone, as was the case for every Patriarch before him. However, he simply wasn't satisfied with this. Of all the Patriarchs in Luxnix history, Seath would not only be the one with the shortest tenure, but he would also be, by far, the most emasculated. Ever since Miguel began to show his talents, Seath had fallen by the wayside, and this crown heir of their family had become the de facto patriarch. In fact, many of Seath's roles in the family now were the very same roles he had had as the former crown heir. It was nothing short of humiliating to an extreme. While he was sweating over the daily tasks of the family, Miguel lived a life of leisure. He had all the resources he could ever want, all the access he could ever want, and even had certain clearances that Seath himself couldn't easily access. Seath had worked his whole life for the sake of claiming the patriarch position, but everything he had dreamed and pined for was put on the back burner for a junior who didn't seem to care very much for the family to begin with. He couldn't understand why those old bastards couldn't see it. Miguel had no family in the Luxnix, he at most had thin blood ties twice or thrice removed. Among all those who called themselves Luxniks in the main family, he was probably the most detached, and he had clearly made it a point not to form ties that were too close to anyone else. However, the Star Order Council were blinded by his talent. Not only had they chosen Miguel over Lionel, but what Seath cared the most about was the fact they had actually chosen Miguel over him. They practically stripped his position of all the power it was worth. He was nothing more than a figurehead for his own family, a happy face to show to outsiders. The latest _AP_SODIs are on _the website. In his youth, he had had dreams of eradicating the Viola and Montex families, claiming the entirety of the sector for the Luxniks. But he had practically been castrated. Everything in the family had entered a state of hibernation, all for the sake of Miguel and his maturation process. Quite frankly, Seath could never hate Lionel as much as he hated Miguel and the Star Order Council. So, why had he released such a signal? Well, wasn't it obvious? He hoped that whoever it was that was protecting Lionel in the shadows could make these bastards suffer. Only in this sort of chaos could he have the chance to rise again and become the patriarch that he was always meant to be. It seemed that in the years of arrogance the Luxniks had been fostering, they had been brewing animosity within their own borders, and from more than one person, at that. Bang! The moment pillar rose up, it smashed into an invisible dome above. The instant the Patriarch's emblem had activated, so too had the protective force art of the Luxniks estate. Visit. For a better user experience, beautiful and complex hieroglyph-like formations crawled through the skies, shimmering in golds, whites and silvers as the call of a bird resounded. The pillar of light splitting into countless pieces. All across the Luxniks estate, thousands of feather sword warriors were alerted, the pins on their lapels lighting up one after another. Their expressions only had time to turn serious before they all vanished as one. Back in the location of the battlefield, the blinding lights only seemed to continue. The number grew in size, the vague outline of several figures taking form. By the time it all faded, the feather sword warriors all stood proud and tall. Of course, this number only included those that were currently in the estate and hadn't been deployed. In addition, there were no 12-point feather sword warriors in sight, as they were the personal guard of the Star Order Council. However, this lineup alone seemed to breathe pressure into the air. Patriarch. The feather sword warriors all respectfully saluted at once. The booming sound of their voices even dwarfed Seath's earlier shout. However, Seath made no move to command them. He was waiting for something in specific. He wasn't going to send these feather sword warriors off to their death, that would do him no good. What he needed was visit. For a better user experience at that moment, a mountainous pressure descended from the skies. Whether by coincidence, an illusion, or maybe reality, the protective barrier of the estate seemed to glow with a fiercer light, even as the concentration of snow force more than doubled in an instant. In the skies, standing upon what seemed like nothing, an old man with a flowing white beard and hair appeared. His ancient robes fluttered in the skies and his sharp eyes scanned the battlefield, taking it all in an instant. His hunched back did nothing to take away from his momentum. Who dares attack my Luxniks family? The momentum dwarfed anything Seath or the feather sword warriors could match. This man would have been very familiar to anyone who had been at the gates several weeks ago. This man was none other than the Star Order elder that had sided with Sparking Star Order, Winged Star Order. The old man seemed to deduce that all of this was caused by Lionel in an instant, the thinking speed of a six-dimensional expert with such strong internal sight being far beyond what most could imagine. He immediately locked onto Lionel, his pressure falling down in waves. However, what he could have never expected was for that pressure to vanish like a refreshing spring breeze just before it could reach Lionel, and right as a light sigh rang through the air. Lionel, who hadn't turned his head back even once since he began to walk forward, even after all the oppressive auras rising to his back, was suddenly forced to stop his steps. Before him, an older woman wearing fluttering white robes stood. A cane of pristine white wood supported her right side, and though her face was covered in the wear of age, it still carried the delicate touch of beauty. Visit. For a better user experience, she gazed toward Lionel with a complicated look, her eyes filled with regret, remorse and sadness. For a moment, it seemed that everything had frozen. Chapter 1140. Empress Fox's gaze twinkled. This was the first time she was seeing her grandson in over 20 years. It was difficult for her to reconcile her emotions all at once. She couldn't help but cast her internal sight toward Noah as well, but when it came to the guilt she held on her shoulders, it was mostly related to Lionel. While she felt terrible about not being able to be a part of Noah's life the way she should have been, her negligence had almost led to Lionel's death. Her negligence was just one matter. Anyone could make the mistake of trusting the wrong person or people. However, the way she dealt with those matters after finding out ended up alienating the entirety of her family. Her husband wanted nothing to do with her. Her daughter could hardly meet her gaze without resentment leaking through. Her son-in-law couldn't stand to even be on the same planet as her. And the family she had sacrificed so much to protect seemed to show her day after day why they weren't worthy of her giving up much of anything. Empress Fox's hand trembled as it rose to Lionel's cheek. In the air, it seemed so very fragile. Despite the sheer strength of the woman who owned it, it felt as though the slightest gust of wind might cause it to collapse. It was only after her frail hand touched Lionel's face that it managed to gain some stability. However, the scalding heat of Lionel's skin didn't escape her attention at all. It felt as though it would burn her completely to ash, but she refused to take her hand away. Empress Fox looked up and into Lionel's eyes. There, she found a gaze that was impossible to read. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. While everyone else saw indifference and apathy, Empress Fox saw something deeper. She could see that Lionel had been scarred by something. The realization made her heart squeeze with an inescapable pang. She could tell that this emotion was completely unrelated to her. Maybe it really was most accurate to say that Lionel met her with indifference. In fact, he couldn't be bothered to snap out of his previous headspace to register the fact that it was his grandmother before him. Empress Fox didn't blame Lionel in the slightest. All she felt was a surging will to protect him. This was her grandson, her baby boy. She would rather suffer through him looking toward him with indifference for the rest of her life so long as he didn't have to suffer any pain or trouble. Empress Fox's thumb lightly rubbed Lionel's cheeks, her eyes holding back tears she didn't want to shed. Northern Star Order, what is the meaning of this? Winged Star Order's voice was tinged with his frown. The name Northern Star Order spoke for itself. There were two categories of titles given to those who joined the Star Order Council. The first were unique names. These were decided by your method of battle, your ability, or any other unique affinities or proclivities you might have. But there was a second category of titles altogether. These were known as hegemonic titles. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, hegemonic titles were passed down from generation to generation, though not so simply. It wasn't rare for a hegemonic title to skip over a generation entirely. In fact, to say it wasn't rare was a misnomer because it was, in practice, quite common for this to happen. In truth, even many of the Star Order Council were in the dark about how these hegemonic titles came about and what exactly their origins were. Only those who inherited the title would become privy to the information that came with it. Within the Luxnix family, there were only 3 hegemonic titles. The first was Snow Star Order. The second was Wise Star Order. And, the final, and most powerful of them, was Northern Star Order. Empress Fox's generation had been greatly blessed. For the first time in Luxnix history, 2 hegemonic titles appeared in the same generation. And, the most fantastic part of it was that this was all predicted to happen by the most recent Wise Star Order. 1 generation removed from Empress Fox, it was deduced by Wise Star Order that the Luxnix would soon have a great rise in talent. Over the next 3 generations, they would enter a wellspring of prosperity that would allow them to finally step through the final threshold and leave the 6th dimension behind. At first, it was unknown just how true this prediction would be. However, in the very next generation, not only was Empress Fox born, but so was her close friend and the inheritor of the Snow Star Order title. It was unprecedented in the Luxnix family's history. Not only had it been more than 20 generations since the last Northern Star Order appeared, but to think that it would appear alongside a Snow Star Order. The family realized then that the fortune told by the wise Star Order was true, and they began to prepare. Visit. For a better user experience, the so-called state of hibernation mentioned by Seath wasn't by accident, nor was it solely due to Miguel. For 2 generations now, the Luxnix had experienced an unprecedented boom in talent, and they were overflowing. In truth, it could be said that they already had the strength to crush both the Viola and Montex family. But they still waited. Waited for the day the 3rd and final generation would mature. Then, they would sweep through the world in one fatal swoop. Unfortunately, over the years, they had made many mistakes. Their overconfidence, sometimes warranted, but most times not, was tearing their family apart from the inside out. Too many had forgotten that this Northern Star Order of theirs even existed. Or, more accurately, they too easily believed that she would simply fall in line just like she always had. But, right now, Northern Star Order was no longer just that. She was a grandmother who had just sensed her grandson's pain. She no longer seemed to care about anything else. In fact, she completely ignored Winged Star Order. Little Leo. What do you want to do? Empress Fox spoke as though even if Lionel asked her for the moon, she would reach out and grab it. Lionel remained silent for a long while. A hint of sadness plagued Empress Fox's gaze. There was nothing that pained her more than her grandson being unwilling to rely on her. But, surprisingly, Lionel finally spoke. I don't want to be here anymore. Lionel's voice was cold, indifferent, and detached. And yet, to her, they were like the most beautiful melody she had ever heard. Visit. For a better user experience, Empress Fox finally couldn't hold back her tears any longer as they fell like droplets of rain gently sliding down delicate leaves. Okay. Grandma will take you away. Chapter 1141. The words felt like a tidal wave amidst a calm lake. Seath might have been aware of just who Lionel was, but it wasn't until Empress Fox spoke these words that this information was suddenly known to everyone else. Whether it was the unranked or ranked arms students, the division heads, the feather sword warriors, or even Winged Star Order himself, they all felt as though time had frozen in place. Branch family member? Who had said such a thing? If the grandson of the Northern Star Order couldn't be considered to be a member of the main branch, then who could? If Winged Star Order hadn't called out Empress Fox's title, maybe many of them would still be in the dark. But, who could dare to call themselves a Luxnix if they weren't aware of the importance of the hegemonic title? Elodie, who had been forced to use his just to keep a hold of his life, suddenly laughed bitterly. He had come to just in time to hear this news, and he wasn't quite sure of how to take it. It wasn't like having a Star Order grandparent was rare. In fact, all 3 of the arm heads could boast such a thing. Lionel had even already met the Wisdom Arm Head's grandmother, Fluttering Star Order. However, having a hegemonic Star Order as a grandparent was a different matter entirely. Those that had been crippled under Lionel's blade deflated. They had spent all their lives hearing about the coming rise of the Luxnix and the importance of the Northern Star Order to all of this. If she wanted to protect her grandson from something, wouldn't it be too easy? The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. Lionel's status had gone from beneath them all to countless levels above in the blink of an eye. And, the worst part was that he had the talent and strength to speak for himself. Empress Fox smiled through her tears and lowered her hand from Lionel's cheek. Stepping to his side, she wrapped an arm around his and led him forward. The pair walked toward the 4 pillars as though there wasn't anyone else around them. Yuri and Savon's confusion reached a new height. They had no idea that Lionel had such ties to the Luxnix. If he did, didn't that mean that what they had done was unnecessary? But wait, did that mean he was keeping it from Aina? Why would he hide such a thing? Of course, they had no idea that Lionel had never kept anything from Aina. Let alone the Luxnix. he had already spoken about even the Morales to her. It was just that he could only tell her what he actually knew, and he had no way of knowing how these families viewed or would receive him. In practice, he was correct to be so skeptical. Wasn't how things were going now evidence enough? He had support of his grandmother, but that clearly couldn't be said for the entirety of the Luxnix family. It wouldn't be long until the two girls understood this as well. Winged Star Order stood in the skies, his expression flickering wildly from time to time. The wrinkles on his face played between tight and loose, seemingly not understanding what state they were needed in. He looked down, his expression becoming ugly. He just noticed that there was an entourage of Viola family here, and judging by it all, their standing was not low. How else could they possibly have Seath escorting them? This only matters all the more troublesome. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, but how could he just allow them to leave? If it wasn't already obvious enough, Lionel's actions and the amount of blood sent in the air painted the picture clearly. It was too obvious that this boy had animosity for them. Winged Star Order wasn't exactly sure how powerful Lionel was, as he hadn't witnessed the battle, but judging by the state of things, it couldn't be poor, right? Winged Star Order grit his teeth, his internal conflict only growing. There was no point in harping on how much others would learn of this matter. The dirty laundry of the Luxnix was already being laid out. The question was, what was the risk assessment on starting this battle? He had no idea how powerful Northern Star Order was. But his spine trembled when he thought of something. There'll be a chance. So long as he's here, he'll definitely be participating in the selection. Miguel will deal with him. He has the largest reason to do so. However, a line still needs to be drawn here. Roja, are you aware of what you are doing? Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Empress Fox continued to not answer, gingerly walking forward as though she required Lionel's support to walk at all. Winged Star Order didn't seem surprised by this lack of an answer. The name Lionel Morales was stricken from the family records 20 years ago. Your entire family line will follow suit. Empress Fox steps paused. A fury lit within her gaze, a bit of her strength imperceptibly leaking outward. She didn't care about herself, but this was a matter of humiliation for her grandson. To bring it up so grandly like this. Her gaze shifted toward Lionel, but he didn't seem to react at all. His mind was elsewhere, and it looked as though he wouldn't react even if the skies collapsed. Realizing this, Reja's heart settled down. There was nothing else of importance here. Since her grandson wanted to leave, she would help him to leave. With slow and steady steps, the two finally entered the world of the Four Pillars. Withdraw. Winged Star Order commanded coldly. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Seath's expression changed. Not only was his patriarch's emblem being treated like thin air, it hadn't even accomplished a fraction of what he hoped it would. But, what was even worse was that the Feather Sword Warrior didn't hesitate to follow these orders. These matters seemed to have diffused, but the reality was that it had only set in motion something that would one day be an indelible part of the Three-Pillar Galaxy's history. At the center of it all, there would be a young woman who currently stood in silence with placid golden eyes and a dull expression. Chapter 1142. Lionel sat in silence, staring out into blank space. His breathing was even, his heartbeat was steady, and there didn't seem to be anything particularly distressing about his current mood. He had returned to the hotel penthouse, but he wasn't alone by any stretch. His grandmother sat across from him with Noah by her side. Her frail hands held onto Noah quite tightly, the two of them exchanging some words. Lionel wasn't really paying attention to what the two were saying, but he could guess. Noah was likely being his usual awkward self, something he faced whenever someone showed him intimacy he wasn't used to, while their grandmother was trying her best to toe the line between forging a relationship while not pressing too hard. Eventually, the topic of their discussion returned to the matters of all those years ago, and Roja couldn't help but sigh. She sent a glance toward Lionel, but his gaze was still aimed out of the tall windows. It was as though his eyes could see to the very ends of planet Luxnix itself. I take full blame, Rozha said lightly. Ever since my birth, the Luxnix have been focused on what they call the hibernation phase. This was essentially a commitment that we made toward preparing the Luxnix for war. In the generation before mine, Ancestor Y's star order made a prediction about the upward trajectory of our family. Though it wouldn't be as exaggerated as hyper-evolution, Ancestor felt that it would only be a step below. Should we grasp this opportunity, maybe even entering such a state wouldn't be impossible. Though I understand why Ancestor made such a prediction and chose to divulge it, oftentimes I wish that he had kept these matters to himself. Even now, Rozha couldn't help but respectfully call this existence Ancestor. In the end, unlike Lionel and Noah, she had been born and raised in the Luxnix family estate. There were many ties that she had that were too difficult to sever even after so long. Why is that, Imperial Grandmother? Noah couldn't help but ask. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. The initial purpose behind the prophecy wasn't in its prediction, it was to warn and stress the importance of patience. By putting a 3-generation number on it, the Luxnix formed a plan based on that assessment. The result was the most peaceful era the Three-Pillar Galaxy has ever faced. It seems like the three families are in harmony now, but the reality is that, for a very long time, there was nothing but endless battle and war. The three-planet formation was, on paper, a safe zone, but in practice, more people died here than anywhere else. The lull in Luxnix activity had a positive effect on the balance between the three families and they too fell into a lull. This allowed the family to enter a state of peaceful growth. Unfortunately, many of the blades turned internal as a result. When a family grows too powerful, to the point they don't have any outside competitors, that is when they also become the most vulnerable. But, it's functionally the same if a family is growing in power and has entered a truce-like state as well. Noah's gaze glowed. One of the things he most admired about his grandfather was the creation of the Slayer Legion. Emperor Fox knew that in the time between the Ascension Empire conquering Earth and the descent of the Metamorphosis, there would be a period of absolute peace. Due to this, it was very likely that the Empire might crumble before the fourth dimension descended. Realizing this problem, Emperor Fox didn't hesitate to sacrifice his strongest blade and turn the Slayer Legion into an enemy the Empire could unite against. Noah had no idea just what level of foresight that would take. Rozha shook her head. In my generation, everything began well. Both the Northern Star Order and the Snow Star Order appeared and we were even very close. The family was very cautious in that time and took the words of Ancestor very seriously. In fact, they were so cautious that neither myself nor Snow Star Order were allowed to participate in the Void Palace's selection. Visit. For a better user experience, however, as you might imagine, that didn't last for long. After your father and aunt were born, the family was a bit unsatisfied with my actions. But, because of the importance the Northern Star Order held, and the fact I was very important to the ascension mentioned by Ancestor, my actions were forgiven, but unfortunately not forgotten. During my generation, both the Viola and Montex families managed to enter a nominal student. This placed pressure on the Luxnix and many believed we had chosen to be too low-key. So, when your aunt was sent to me by your grandfather and began to display her talents, it was already decided that she would take part in the selection. She was the perfect candidate. Her eye color was different from the usual Luxnix and made it seem like she was a branch family member. Thanks to this, even if she had an astounding performance, it wouldn't raise too much alarm toward the Luxnix main family, but she could also release some of the pressure simultaneously. Everything went well and your aunt performed astoundingly, entering as a quadrant-ranked disciple. Of course, if not for the fact Earth was still in the third dimension back then, causing her world spirit and emperors might lineage factors to be dormant, she would have likely placed even higher. By then, her climb up the disciple rankings would have been far easier as well, but trouble came again when your aunt returned to the family pregnant. Your aunt was meant to be the perfect cog in their plans. She was just Luxnix enough to be a part of us, but just enough not Luxnix that she could be used as a tool. But, your aunt didn't seem to acknowledge the fact that this was her use. Rather than marrying into a distant branch of the main family and birthing a pure-breed Luxnix, your aunt had taken the same path I did. However, once again, we were forgiven. I was the Northern Star Order, and your aunt had already become a galaxy-ranked disciple. What couldn't be forgiven, though, was that little Leo was simply too talented. Rija's expression darkened, an array of complex emotions flickering through her gaze and expression. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. This was already the third and final generation, and talents continued to pop up. But there was too great of a power imbalance. Our branch of the main family carried with it too much of the talent, and we had proven time and time again that we didn't listen. When your cousin was born, the fact he almost took your aunt's life was only one aspect, but the phenomena he brought with his first cry was a different matter entirely. To be born with an innate node was already rare enough. But, to have one of the caliber of the Scarlet Star innate node was a different matter entirely. I was too naive. I thought that I had shown enough loyalty to the family, even leaving behind my husband and son to remain within the estate. I took on so much work, and my every day was breathed for the sake of the moment the hibernation phase would end. But that day when I saw your cousin, my little Leo, he had gone from a baby boy so large and full of life to one that couldn't even breathe on his own. His skin had paled, his eyes lost their color, he was crying, he never cried. He was such a good baby. Rija's tears fell like a flood, but her next words were laced with a dense cold. I killed them. I killed them all. Her hands trembled as though she was back there once again. She could see the cold gaze of the woman she had once called friend, she could see the impatient and condescending sneer of her husband. Everyone who had been there, looking over her grandson's small little body, watching as he struggled to even breathe without even lifting a finger, she killed them all. The very reason Miguel was an orphan, the reason he had no close relatives, parents, or grandparents to call his own, was precisely because Roja saw nothing but red that day. Visit. For a better user experience, and among those that fell, was the Snow Star Order of old. Chapter 1143. It took quite a long time for Roja to calm down after reaching this part in her story. The relationship she had had with Snow Star Order was very deep. They had only been born a few weeks apart and had grown up like sisters. They had practically been attached at the hip ever since they could crawl on their own. Even after so many years, Roja couldn't find it within her to get over that betrayal. In the moment, the fury she felt for the injustice her grandson had faced trumped everything, but when Snow Star Order's blood touched her palm and the last of her blood was drained away, it all hit her like a speeding truck. Not only did someone she thought of as a sister betray her, but now she had to suffer the weight and guilt of having killed her and her entire family as well. One might say that she had no reason to feel guilty, and she had only punished those that deserved to be punished. And, maybe such thoughts were correct to have. Anyone who would do such a thing to a child simply didn't deserve to live. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, unfortunately, the human mind wasn't always strictly rational. For some time, Roja only blamed herself. Maybe if she had shown the family more support, maybe if she hadn't been so selfish in her choices, maybe if she had followed the rules of the family more closely, maybe things wouldn't have needed to go so far. Roja understood why Snow Star Order had done what she did. While Roja seemed to always be able to live life the way she pleased, choosing the husband she wanted, allowing her daughter to do the same, raising a family of her own, and even benefiting with talented children and grandchildren as a result, Snow Star Order never got this chance. In fact, in a lot of ways, her life was made harder due to Roja. Roja got to pick her own husband, but Snow Star Order's marriage was arranged. Rija's daughter was the gem of the family, but Snow Star Order's own offspring were mediocre at best, unable to match up to the talent of their mother. Rija's daughter once again got the right to choose her own husband, but Snow Star Order had to watch as her own daughter was forced down the same path as herself. When Snow Star Order saw that Rija's grandchild was still far more talented than her own, maybe if one chose to be sympathetic, they could at least understand her thoughts and the motivations behind why she did it. While on the surface the reasoning was to bring more balance to the family and rein in what power Rija's branch seemed to be accumulating, the truth underlying those actions was jealousy. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. That day I was barely able to stabilize the situation, but I wasn't sure what else to do. The Scarlet Star innate node is especially volatile and difficult to handle. It was one matter if little Leo was perfectly healthy, but having already barely survived one operation, there was no telling if he'd be able to survive another. At the same time, while I held fury for their branch of the main family, the child that was given little Leo's innate node was innocent and couldn't make decisions of his own. However, at the time, it really seemed like the little one would suffer due to the decisions of his seniors. Assimilating another's innate node isn't rare and there's even quite a large black market for it. However, how well it works is highly dependent on what the node is and how it fits with your affinities. While the little one had the important star and light elemental affinities, he lacked the fire affinity. In addition, even if he did have it, the Scarlet Star innate node is a different beast altogether. Wuxia took in a deep breath and sighed. For a while, it seemed that the family would lose both geniuses. Little Leo was very weak and frail after losing innate node while Miguel was constantly suffering backlash. If not for the preparation Snow Star Order had made, Miguel would have died long ago. Unfortunately, even Snow Star Order had underestimated the Scarlet Star node and it all wasn't enough. Seeing how things were going, even at the sacrifice of an innocent child, I was willing to attempt to transfer little Leo's innate node back to him. After all, though both children were innocent, I couldn't possibly choose another child over my own grandson, right? Plus, what life did Miguel have ahead of him? His living would only complicate the family's internal strife in the future. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, but it was then that little Val returned with your aunt. Back then, he was, rightfully, furious. If not for the guilt I harbored in my heart, it was likely that there would be no Luxnix family remaining. I know that, he was right. Snow Star Order wouldn't have done what she did without the consent of the rest of the Star Order Council, and I knew that Snow Star Order's family had ties to many other main family branches due to her and her daughter's arranged marriages. But I still couldn't bring myself to allow it. I will be as honest and upfront with you two as I can. I was weak, and I was always too tied up with former ties. Due to that, I ended up alienating your aunt and your mother, as well as your uncle-in-law and your father. I relied on my relationship with Alienor to get Velasco to promise not to seek revenge. However, in return, they both resented me for it. Rija's gaze grew a bit misty. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, her son-in-law was a man she never saw without a smile on his face. He always had a joke to tell or a prank to pull. She had to admit to herself that due to this, she thought that he would be easy to convince. In fact, she hadn't even known the true strength of her son-in-law until after that talk they had that day. Velasco had fallen into a silence and didn't say a word to her. It was only after Alienor described Velasco's origins to her did she understand that it wasn't her protecting Velasco from the Luxnix, but it was rather the other way around. Chapter 1144. Rija's gaze drifted to Lionel once again. But, even now, his gaze was still trained outside the tall windows. He didn't seem to have heard anything Roja said, but Roja didn't decide to push the matter. She didn't know what it was that Lionel was going through, but she felt like she didn't have the right to ask. She hadn't been able to be a part of her grandson's life for so long, so how could she just appear now and expect him to bare his soul to her? Soon after these matters, Velasco took little Leo to Earth. I'm not certain of what his reasoning was entirely, but it was likely that the combination of friendly atmosphere plus low-dimensional world was the best environment for little Leo's recovery. In his weakened state, staying in a sixth-dimensional world was more of a detriment to little Leo than anything else. But as for the specifics of how little Leo was cured, I'm not sure. I can only say that it's good that you've grown up so strong and powerful. A calm silence fell over the penthouse suite. The truth was that Lionel was listening, though not actively. With the way his mind worked, unless he used dream sense, it was impossible for him not to capture every little detail within hundreds of meters of himself. The only question was whether he would acknowledge it now, or later. But, after what he experienced today, this benefit seemed more like a curse than anything else. Lionel didn't really know what he was feeling right now. In reality, maybe his grandmother was the only one able to tell that he was feeling much of anything at all. To everyone else, his face was quite indifferent and placid, as though he didn't have any emotions to speak of at all. Who knew, maybe it was a mother's intuition refined over 2 generations. They always say that a woman's intuition is strong. It would be one thing if Lionel had chosen to cut Aina off completely. But, according to his balance scale, she had just barely managed to stay in his heart. The issue with that was now he had to drag all of this baggage around. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, he didn't feel like doing much of anything. The moment he had seen her, it was like all the accumulated momentum and drive he had built up over this last year had vanished in an instant, drained out of him by a single look. If he was honest, it was mildly infuriating. It wasn't an anger he felt toward Aina, it was one he felt toward himself. He might have been fine with this feeling had he still had no goals or aspirations, but the current him wanted to accomplish something far bigger and larger than himself. To be weighed down by such emotion, such useless trash, it pissed him off. He almost wanted a reason, any reason at all, to cut this all away from himself like it was some sort of malignant tumor. Due to all of this, he hadn't even been able to properly react to the truth of his history with the Luxniks. Was he more mad now? Indifferent, maybe? He didn't really know, it was like his emotions were on a delayed timer, but now that the proper moment to react had passed, it was already too late to do much of anything about it. Did he want to vent? Not really. If it was about venting, wouldn't the best place to do so have been the Luxniks' estate? He couldn't very well go back. Did he want to speak with Aina? Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, he didn't particularly want to do this either. They say a picture spoke 1,000 words, well, a snapshot of Lionel's memory spoke millions. He didn't feel there would be anything to gain from speaking with her. Did he want to replace her? He felt no drive to do such a thing. Maybe a woman would help him clear his mind and focus, but whoever that woman was would only end up being a tool. At best, they'd be a prostitute. Such a person wouldn't be a replacement to begin with. Then what did he want to do? Well, sitting here felt all right. Lionel's eyes drifted close, an odd peace overcoming him. In all his calculations, the one thing he didn't note was exactly how long it had been since he simply rested. When Lionel was with Aina, even when they didn't need to sleep, they would do so. Of course, a part of that was due to their shenanigans in the bedroom, but Aina was always a reminder for him to rest as well. If there were 2 things Aina loved to do, the first was to eat a lot, and the second was to sleep. With her ability, she always knew exactly what her body needed to maximize her growth into the future, so rest and food were 2 of her biggest appetites. Visit. For a better _user experience, ironically, it was meeting with Aina again after so long that seemed to hit Lionel like a Pavlovian response. Before he realized what was happening, his mind sank into darkness and, for the first time in a long while, his thoughts finally came to a stop. As fast as Lionel's mind moved, he hadn't realized just how much he needed sleep. He had taken on so much weight onto his shoulders in such a short time that he didn't realize just how much it was all weighing him down. What he and no one else could have possibly expected was that this rest of his would last an entire month. His mind and body both entered a state of hibernation. However, what was unique about it all was that with the second awakening of his healing branch, rest for Lionel was far different than rest for others. In the past, when Lionel rested, he would use dream sense to multiply the effect of his sleep. But, that was ultimately just a parlor trick. While it would refresh his mind, his body was only falling further and further behind in its rest. This time, though, Lionel didn't have the time to activate dream sense as he wasn't even aware he was drifting asleep. The result was both his mind and body shutting down. Under the second awakening of the healing branch, after not having a proper rest in years, it was like Lionel's body was being refreshed and rebooted. It was impossible to tell just what changes there would be when he awoke. By then, though, it would be time for the selection to begin. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Chapter 1145. Eleanor sat by Lionel's bedside, her expression one of endless doting. Every so often, she would glide a shimmering towel across her son's forehead as though she couldn't stand the slightest hint of dirt or dust touching him at all. After Lionel met with her mother, Eleanor thought it would be easy to finally swoop in and see her son. But the result was actually outside of her expectations. What was something she had been looking forward to for decades became something her hands trembled at the thought of doing. In a lot of ways, Lionel falling into a deep sleep like this was a great help to her. She got to be by her son's side and take care of him without the weight of 2 decades of baggage. She felt more at peace now than she had in a very long time. Her eyes glistened with tears when she thought of all the milestones she had missed. Though she could watch them through Velasco's eyes, it just wasn't the same. She didn't get to watch Lionel take his first steps, or be there for his first day of school. She never got the chance to watch any of his football games or teach him how to impress the girl he liked. Eleanor smiled lightly, soon beginning to giggle beside herself. Her husband had always said that the worst people to ask for advice on women as a man was other women. Do you think a gazelle is going to teach a lion how to hunt them? That was what her husband had said. Velasco suffered the pinch of all pinches for saying these words, but thinking back on it now, Eleanor couldn't help but laugh. Her husband was always saying wild and outlandish things. Compared to him, her son was definitely the far more handsome and refined gentleman. Eleanor's smile became somewhat sad. She shook her head and dabbed her son's forehead again. Her son was so perfect, how could any woman make him go through such things? She didn't like this Aina at all. If it wasn't for her worrying about how her son would react, she would have taught that girl a lesson a long time ago. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. I will change the bed sheets again. Eleanor transferred Lionel to another bed and replaced the sheets once again, even swapping out the pillows. If Lionel had been awake, he would have known where his meticulousness came from. Aina had always said his room was frighteningly clean and tidy, but witnessing his mother change bedsheets twice a day despite the fact he was giving off next to no impurities at all would make Lionel realize there was always a taller mountain somewhere. Eleanor smiled brilliantly as she laid her son down to rest again, gently combing his hair with her fingers and dabbing his forehead once more. A month had already passed by now and many were waiting on the selection to begin. However, Eleanor had told them all to wait. What a joke. These people would just have to patiently stand by until her baby boy woke up. Lionel's eyes slowly opened. Rather than feeling the usual grogginess one might expect from just waking up, especially after sleeping so long, he actually felt refreshed to an alarming degree. It was to the point where even the air he was breathing tasted better. Lionel rose up and slid to the side of the bed. His bare feet touched the soft carpet and his mind subconsciously outlined every fiber. It was like the touch of his skin was no less sensitive than his actual internal sight now. Visit. For a better user experience 6700000. Lionel's pupils constricted. His number of split minds had been just over 5 million before he fell asleep, but now they were actually approaching almost 40% more. At the same time, even the most subtle of movements his body underwent made his bones crackle and pop as though they were breathing sighs of relief. Lionel didn't need to stand to know that he had grown another 2 inches. He had been about 66 before, but now he was nearly 69 or 205 centimeters. He squeezed his fists, feeling the changing as his muscle fibers flexed and blood rushed to his limbs. He could almost see the light bouncing off his tan skin as though he was truly made of metal. Though, maybe he technically was. Lionel ran his fingers through his hair. It grew out again. Lionel shook his head and with practiced motions cut it off. A slight violet glow shimmered before his hair was coerced into being cut. Finally, as always, he stored it all away. Lionel rose up, realizing that he was only wearing a pair of white boxers. He blinked, suddenly realizing that he definitely did not own these. It dawned on him that someone must have been changing his clothes in his sleep. He wasn't exactly shy, but he couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. At that moment, Lionel's stomach suddenly growled. Before he could think that he was hungry, Lionel spotted an enormous spread of food in the penthouse's dining room. He most definitely didn't need to be asked twice and immediately dove in. Bang! Visit. For a better user experience, cap. The doors of the penthouse slammed open as a rush of people came in. Lionel didn't get to say anything before he was tackled and dog-piled, his poor beast leg flying out of his hands. Raja's rotund figure was the first to collide with him and Milan followed suit not long after. Before Lionel could react, he found himself being piled by at least 6 200-pound men on the most conservative end, with the likes of Raj and Milan pushing and crossing 300. Lionel coughed. You guys couldn't pick a better time? I'm starving here. Lionel's muffled voice sounded beneath the pattern. Shut up, Cap. Let me love you. Gimme a kiss. Lionel found himself fighting for his life beneath a pile of grown men, dodging lips left and right. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience for the first time in a while, he laughed. Chapter 1146. Hours later, Lionel seemed to have finally noticed something weird about his brothers. You all. How'd you grow so powerful so quickly? The dining room table had been cleared of all food and Lionel was even sporting a small pot belly. His stomach never showed this sort of effect after eating, so it could only be said that he had truly stuffed himself full this time. By the end of it, he finally noticed the changes in his teammates. Judging by a few factors, it should have only been about 5 weeks since the last time he woke up. Yet, he could feel that the auras of his teammates were all several times stronger. If it had taken 3 of them to match a branch family member before, they could probably fight one-on-one to a stalemate now. Of course, this still left them far short of the Luxnix family main branch along with the other main branches. But, it was a shocking change nonetheless. After Lionel thought about it though, he felt that it made sense. For such talents, just staying and acclimating to a 6-dimensional world over an extended period of time would cause great positive changes to their strength. The pressure of such a high-level world would squeeze out the latent potential they had within themselves and allow their talents to shine forth. I didn't consider this before, but this is good, right. Granny Fox has been helping us out. She made a training regimen for us all and we've been following it for the past few weeks. Franco explained. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel's brows shot up. It took him a moment to realize that Franco was actually talking about his grandmother. His lip curled into a smile. Oh. What did she make you guys do? The dining room suddenly turned quiet. Even Alan's face tinged with red as he pushed his glasses up his nose, unwilling to make eye contact with Lionel. The only one who seemed alright was Milan. She put us through a routine of cardio and stretching, nothing major. She just said that we had the talent, it was just that our bodies had not been placed under appropriate pressure. Lionel's gaze immediately picked up the weird gazes of everyone when Milan said stretches. Suddenly, he felt a great camaraderie with the brothers around him. He, too, understood the complex emotions associated with working on your flexibility. Even to this day, he hadn't allowed anyone to see him stretch using that technique he got from the Valiant Heart Zone. As for Milan, of course he was uncaring. He took his flexibility the most seriously of all of them. Despite his 300-pound frame, he had actually spent quite some time as a gymnast and even dabbled in ballet. Milan surprisingly took them both quite seriously, so he was rarely made fun of for it. Lionel was filled with sympathy. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, the location was Planet Montex. Of the 3 families, they seemed to be the most silent, however the training their youths had been undergoing was anything but. Much like their tall mountains which pierced through their atmosphere and gave their world devilish horns, they too were stoically persistent. Maybe due to this or by coincidence, Planet Montex was chosen as the starting grounds for the selection. After over a week of delays, the selection was finally beginning and the pent-up anticipation seemed only steps away from blowing. Amongst the Montex family youths, there was one particular young man that Lionel would recognize very well. That day in the Dimensional Cleanse trial zone, in order to claim the fifth dimensional piece, Lionel had been forced to fight not just one, but two people. One of those two people was Richard. The other was Higlis, a young man who wielded an enormous hammer with the weight of a small mountain. Who knew what the odds were of meeting two potential heirs of this three-pillar sector at once? But all that was important was the fact that Higlis hadn't forgotten Lionel. He too had wanted to rely on the fifth dimensional layer to maximize his chances at becoming crown heir. Unfortunately, he wasn't as meticulous or scheming as Richard. The result was that he was still vying for position while Richard had already claimed his crown heir position for himself. To Higlis, this selection was the opportunity he needed to secure his position for life. So long as he could become a nominal disciple, he was set. But of course, this wasn't the limit of his ambition. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, many forces converged onto Planet Montex. Among them, the Montex, Viola and the Luxnix weren't the only ones. There was also Raya's sage family and numerous others who could only be considered to be a step beneath the three pillars. Within this throng of people, Lionel, his brothers and his friends could be considered to be the most leisurely. While others were scrambling for position, they had already found their seats. It was unknown what was being planned, and even Lionel was still unaware that the overseer of this event was actually his own mother. But the Void Palace had set aside a large arena. Or, more accurately, the Montex had one built at their behest. Lionel assumed that there would be some group challenges ahead, or else Fluttering Star Order wouldn't have tried to invest so much into branch family members. But, he wasn't sure if this was set in stone, or if Fluttering Star Order had only been preparing for the possibility. By Lionel's side, his grandmother held onto his arm like a frail old lady. One would think that she had a step in the grave already, but judging by her current vitality, living for several hundred more years wouldn't be a problem in the slightest. At the moment, Rija's mood was very good as Lionel's attitude toward her after waking up was far better than what she had expected. She thought that Lionel hated her, when the reality was just that Lionel hadn't been in the mood for pleasantries previously. Even knowing his grandmother's role in protecting the Luxnix, he didn't hate her. In fact, he quite appreciated her. Wouldn't Lionel be too much of a hypocrite if he hated his grandfather's actions on one end, but was alright with genocide on another just because he had been wronged? If anything, of all his relatives, his grandmother's personality was the most in line with himself. Visit. For a better user experience over the last few days, the grandmother-grandson pair had become a lot closer and Rija's wrinkles seemed to vanish one after another the longer she spent smiling. She hadn't felt so happy in a very long time. She almost didn't care what the Luxnix did from now on. Like this, the arena which could house millions was slowly filled to the brim. Chapter 1147. Lionel split a bit of his attention to pay attention to the surroundings. Truthfully, the idea of joining yet another organization made him feel pretty weird on the inside. It could only be said that his luck wasn't the best when it came to such things. Though his relationship with Camelot, the Slayer Legion and Valiant Heart Mountain could all be considered to be positive now, though the latter was now destroyed, the rockiness he had experienced at the start of his relationship with them was still firmly imprinted onto Lionel's mind. After leaving Valiant Heart Mountain, Lionel had truly thought that he would never join another organization again. He had plans to simply build up his own faction until it was time for the Morales family's heir wars. Though Lionel didn't know how the Morales saw him, or if they might treat him the same way the Luxnix had or not, he had enough reason to believe that so long as he won these heir wars, it wouldn't matter. The fact that he had two of their most important family heirlooms in hand spoke for itself. After learning about the Void Palace, though, Lionel realized that he didn't really have much of a choice in the matter. Whether he wanted to or not, if he had aspirations of reaching the pinnacle of the dimensional verse, joining the Void Palace was a must. To describe the importance of the Void Palace in the simplest way possible, they were the guardians of the human domain. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Any dream Lionel had of uniting the dimensional verse would, without a shadow of a doubt, have to pass through them. It could even be said that becoming the head of the Void Palace would be a shortcut, at least to claiming the human domain, that is. Even if this wasn't the case, the Void Palace had vast stores of information Lionel couldn't miss out on. Whether it was information about other domains, thoughts and ideologies Lionel had never touched before, or even something as plain as techniques and styles, Lionel had to grasp them all. It was a foothold of such importance that he could only grab onto it. Lionel had always had a phobia of missing out. Of course, this wasn't a phobia about events or people, but rather, knowledge. He hated the idea of taking less efficient paths simply because of his own ignorance. He had experienced that feeling all too often since he entered the dimensional verse. One such example was the truth behind why so many of the youths participating in the selection had stopped at Tier 7. Even Richard, the crown heir of the Viola, was only at Tier 8 currently. Of course, the obvious answer was that the Void Palace only accepted those beneath the 6th dimension. But, this was just one layer of the answer. Firstly, if they accepted those beneath the 6th dimension, why stop at Tier 7 or 8? Wouldn't it maximize your chances if you continue to the quasi-6th dimension level? That would still meet the requirements, right? Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, you could say that maybe these geniuses simply hadn't had the time, yet. But, this answer only made sense for the first few times. Oddly, though, every expert Lionel ran across as they continued to flood this arena were all the same. There were simply too many of them for it to be a coincidence. They couldn't possibly all be too young, right? Then, there was the second oddity. Why beneath the 6th dimension? Weren't there talents of all levels to be found everywhere? The former guild head of the Milky Way Guild, Augustus, was a great example. Augustus was a special sort of talent, able to enter the 6th dimension while bound by the constraints of a 5th dimensional world. The difficulty in doing so was astronomical. Though some of this could be attributed to him taking advantage of the 6th dimensional galaxies that wanted to take advantage of him, this only went to further bolster and prove his skill. However, according to the rules of the Void Palace, they would reject him no matter what. When Lionel asked his grandmother about this, it was only at this point that he managed to understand why this was. The 6th dimension was an important crossroads and was divided into two major paths. First, there was a conventional path which essentially reboot and reframed the progress you made in the previous 3 dimensions. Visit. For a better user experience, to explain it as simply as possible, with the conventional path, your 6th dimension would become a rerun of the 3rd dimension where you would form more and strengthen your innate nodes. Following this, the 7th dimension along this path would be redo of the 4th dimension where you would once again strengthen your body. And, the 8th dimension would become a reboot of the 5th dimension. Of course, those who took this path would still be able to become extremely powerful and weren't necessarily worse off than those who took the opposing path. However, while they weren't necessarily worse off, it would be impossible to reach the ceiling of those who took the other path. Also known as the God Path. Should one choose the God Path, they would have a chance to reach the true peak of the dimensional verse. Of course, once again, those that chose the conventional path weren't necessarily weaker, and there were many who chose this path that could match top experts of the God Path. However, without fail, the strongest individuals of the dimensional verse had stepped onto this second, unconventional path. In order to take the God Path, however, one needed to start early. The priming for diverging and taking this route began at Tier 7 of the 5th dimension. Using that buffer period, one could slowly begin to mold themselves and prepare. Once again, Lionel realized that he had almost missed out on something greatly important. He couldn't help but feel that his dad was really too casual with informing him about such things. How could he pick any path other than the God Path? Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Lionel's gaze suddenly shifted toward a certain direction, an aura of pure white gold descending as the Luxnix family arrived. Sorry everyone, I started on DD chapters really late today, LMAO. But you guys are probably used to late chapters by now. More on the way. Chapter 1148. The arrival of the Luxniks could only be said to be quite grandiose. Being the last of the three major families to arrive, they seemed to have made it a point to make a statement. But, maybe this only made sense. After 3 generations of slowly biding their time, they could finally see success on the horizon. This selection would be the time for them to rise. An enormous golden bird flew through the skies. And yet, somehow, it carried not the slightest hint of a shadow. If Lionel had to describe it in just a few words, he would most definitely choose Golden Phoenix. It had a long and slender neck of perfect groomed plumes. Its wings gently flapped despite its size, wafting about intoxicating scents and unintrusive winds. Its tail feathers sparkled with delicate patterns, filling all those who saw it with awe. A sonorous call left the beak of the majestic bird. It rang through the arena like the clanging of a silver bell. Somehow, it didn't feel annoying in the slightest but rather filled one with amazement and worship. By now, Lionel would have usually looked away, displaying a sheer lack of interest. However, he wasn't the type of person to fake what he was feeling, at least not when it came to matters that weren't superficial. While others saw a bird, Lionel saw one of the most elaborate and complex force arts he had ever laid eyes on. Regardless of how he felt about the Luxniks family, he didn't take his eyes off of it, his gaze filled with curiosity and awe. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, whether it was the lack of shadow, the wind-movement ratio, or even the number of people it could carry, everything about this bird seemed to defy the laws of physics and left Lionel intrigued. Creating such a lifelike creature was definitely something the Camelot magic system couldn't accomplish. While the Camelot magic system was good at taking artistic conceptions and functionally applying them to an attack or defense, it didn't have the malleability to form such a lifelike creation. Lionel wasn't very surprised by this. If one magic system could accomplish everything, then there would never be a need for so many to exist. This was especially so for force art languages. Lionel knew 3 currently. One was the Morales family's crafting arts, the second was the Camelot mage arts, and the final was the very first he had ever learned, the nameless force art capable of transcribing abilities into an art. Of them, Lionel was the most unfamiliar with the third. He always had at the back of his mind just how dangerous the person who could use this ability was, but that was about it. At the level he had comprehended it to, he could at most copy low-level abilities that couldn't even really be considered to be at the first level of an ability index. Within the piles of Luxniks core texts and teachings Lionel's mother had left behind to him, the Luxniks family's force art discipline was detailed within it as well. Until now, Lionel hadn't paid much attention to it as there were many other techniques that had caught his attention. But, seeing it all at work before him left him astonished. Grandma, how familiar are you with the Luxniks force art techniques? The latest _AP_SODIs are on _the website. Roja blinked. She had expected that Lionel was staring so intently at the Luxniks' arrival because he was still enraged or angered. She hadn't been sure of whether to try to comfort him or leave him be, but to think that Lionel was actually just observing the bird because he was curious about it. Such a turn of events left her stunned before her smile bloomed. It wasn't the first time Lionel had called her grandma, but she still felt her heart bloom whenever she heard it. She was very much excited that Lionel was actually asking something of her. I know a little. Do you want me to teach you? Rija's gaze glowed. She forgot all about the Luxniks and even forgot about everyone in her surroundings. Her only focus was pleasing her grandson. Lionel smiled. I'm just a bit curious. It's unlike anything I've seen before. I remember that elder sparking star order. When I met her before, she tapped her cane and her body was enveloped in fluttering butterflies that seemed shaped of fire. Was that an application of the Luxniks force arts? Roja seemed to grow younger by several years every time Lionel spoke to her. Yes, you could say so. Sparking Star Order is among the most skilled in the Luxniks force arts. Are the butterflies just an aesthetic choice, or? Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Lionel actually wasn't sure. He didn't have a high enough understanding of the Luxnix force arts to make an assessment. Plus, seeing through the technique of such a high-level 6-dimensional expert was beyond even his means. Not exactly, though in part. Roja patiently explained, the Luxnix force arts are very good at embodying and manipulating life force. When Sparking Star Order taps her cane and summons her butterflies, she's using a fusion of her ability and her comprehension of force arts to disperse her aura and make her teleportation impossible to track. The flapping of the butterfly's wings are more than just an aesthetic choice, as the frequency they do so at is very important. Even the most skilled of internal sights would find trouble tracking her down. It makes her movement both flexible and unpredictable. Roja divulged a major secret of one of the Luxnix family Star Order elders without blinking an eye. I see. Flexibility, huh? Lionel fell into thought. Roja nodded. If the strength of the Luxnix force arts was to be described in one word, it's adaptability. What it loses out in strength, it makes up for by melding into the perfect technique for the situation. Take a sensory force art as an example. A more rigid force art language might send a ripple into the surroundings to send back a static image to the user. But, with the Luxnix force art language, you might instead form and send out several wolf constructions. Their adaptability would be several-fold greater. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Roja patiently taught her grandson what she knew, the two seemingly lost in their own world as the golden phoenix of the Luxnix touched down, dispersing to reveal a shocking reality. The Luxnix was being headed not by their patriarch, and not by a Star Order elder, but rather a single young man of barely over 20 years of age. Chapter 1149. A subtle silence fell over the arena. While many here could be considered to have only come for the fun of the spectacle, there was a matter of perspective needed as well. This arena could sit millions. However, the population of a single planet was counted in the tens of billions. The number of habitable planets in just a single quadrant could be counted in the hundreds. The number of quadrants in a single galaxy were numerous, and the number of galaxies in a single sector could be counted in the dozens. When these numbers are multiplied out, there were easily hundreds of trillions of people in a single sector, and even that number was far too small to adequately paint the truth of the situation. Yet. There were only millions who could afford to be here. Even the most low-level heckler within this crowd was a tycoon back on their home world. There wasn't a single person present that wasn't sharp and intelligent, not to mention well-versed in the matters of politics and the importance of image. For the Luxnix to make such a grand entrance, all for the sake of allowing a young man to lead them all, it spoke volumes. In fact, it spoke so loud that everyone could only fall into an abject silence. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Lionel, who had been speaking with his grandmother, didn't really react to this. He found the Luxnix force arts far more fascinating than whatever grand entrance they had planned. Plus, he had already heard the story about Miguel. He wasn't very astonished to feel something similar to his own innate node. That said, he sensed something quite curious about his original innate node. But, he shook his head and didn't mind it. If he hadn't managed to regrow his innate node back, he might be more infuriated. But after learning what happened, Lionel didn't particularly hate Miguel. In fact, he felt quite bad for Miguel. After all, the actions of his parents caused him to be raised without family. Lionel had seen what a lack of familial love could do to a person. Every time he thought of Aina's deepest insecurities, it was often always related back to this. In addition, he could see how great it was to have great family and friends around him every day. He had grown up with his father by his side, and knowing that his mother and grandmother loved him filled him with a full sort of feeling. Even knowing that his grandfather had cut contact with his grandmother mostly due to himself even somewhat changed his opinion of the old man. Though he and his grandfather could never be on the same page, there was an odd complex emotion that Lionel couldn't help but feel knowing that the old man still loved him. But Miguel had never experienced any of this. Visit. For a better user experience, sure, there was plenty of love around him coming from the Luxnix family elders. But didn't they all just see him as a tool to be used? They didn't love him unconditionally like his mother or father could have. They only loved him insofar as his talent could bring their family to the next level. When Lionel finally looked up and his gaze landed on Miguel, what he felt wasn't rage or fury. All he felt was pity. Miguel didn't look around, nor did he react to the crowd's gaze. With light steps, he walked toward the region of participants, taking a seat in the section left to the Luxnix. His expression couldn't be said to be indifferent, but he was clearly uncaring. He felt that everything was far beneath his notice. Even knowing that Aina was nearby, Miguel didn't even glance in her direction. The matters of the bronze tablet was still at the back of his mind, but he had chosen to take these matters slowly, a single step at a time. There were simply too many ways to interpret the words of a prophecy, and he was willing to let things bear themselves out naturally. The elders of the Luxnix smiled toward Miguel with feelings of gratification clear in their gaze. Without a word, he had very clearly suppressed the momentum of all the geniuses present. How could they not feel fulfilled? Visit. For a better user experience after so long, it was time they bare their fangs. With a whoosh, the elders of the Luxnix rose to the stadium seats, leaving the ground region for the participants. Among those that had come, there was Winged, Sparking and Resting Star Order. After a quick sweep, Winged Star Order's gaze narrowed when he noticed Roja. Lionel, the geniuses of Earth, and his grandmother currently all sat on the ground floor. However, their seating arrangements were oddly luxurious, even more so than the three main families. Many had chalked it up to the appearance of Roja, but the members of the Luxnix found that there was something decidedly odd about all of this. Before Winged Star Order could think about just what was going on and understand why his heart was feeling uncomfortable, Orynyx suddenly appeared in the middle of the vast arena. In that moment, a wide sweeping pressure emitted from him. Orynyx was usually a calm and scholarly young man. His dark skin was always glistening and perfectly taken care of. His clothing never had even the slightest wrinkled. And his aura was always reserved and as calm as a lake. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience after spending so long in the Luxnix family, many of the elders had come to this very same conclusion. But, suddenly seeing him flip a switch like this and release a pressure that made even them burst into a cold sweat. They finally realized just how large the difference between them and a young man who was ultimately just a galaxy-ranked disciple was. Orynyx might have been amiable and scholarly usually, but right now, he was representing the Void Palace, the protectors of the human domain and the greatest shield of humanity. This was no longer for himself. This would be a day those present would never forget. Chapter 1150. Orynyx took a deep breath. Just this subtle action seemed to agitate the atmosphere itself, a sweeping wind flying about the arena. I will not explain to you all the weight the title of Void Palace Disciple holds, because quite frankly, the majority of you all are not worthy of knowing. Instead, I will only tell you all that if you miss this opportunity, it will be one you regret for a lifetime. Today will be the first of 3 days of trials. Usually, we have something of a more elaborate plan, but this time around, we will use the simplest and most crude of methods. What Orynyx didn't explain was that this was due to the actions of Lionel's mother. In order to allow the youth of Earth more spots to be selected, it could be said that she abused her power to expand the selection. This wasn't exactly rare, as many overseers would do similar things when they were sent back to their home sectors. Due to this, the Void Palace usually had a policy of sending over those who could be unbiased. Because of these factors, Alienor wasn't meant to return. But, due to the interference of Lionel's father and a series of events not many were aware of, the Void Palace ended up making yet another exception. In truth, the Void Palace wasn't too worried about this at all because... Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience, there will be no absolute fairness. If you cannot make it through these rounds and rise to the top in just this sector, you would have never stood a chance upon reaching the Void Palace. Don't think me out to be cruel. If anything, we are saving your lives. The selection that takes place here could never match up to even a tenth of the difficulty in the Void Palace's true selection. If you can't prove yourself here, you would never be able to do so there. Orinik's words were strict and allow no room for rebuttal. In any sort of crude tournament format, expecting fairness was impossible. Even in the case that the organizers knew every single little detail about the participants and could organize the perfect tournament brackets, there would still be a few who ended up with a raw deal, let alone the fact that the people of Void Palace had no way of knowing all these secrets. If you could perfectly predict everything, what would be the point in the selection to begin with? You might as well just pick out your favorites and get it over with. Orinik was wizened enough to know the hearts of people and how they could complain about such things, so he laid the cards out on the table immediately. He wouldn't allow the organization of this selection to go awry. With these formalities out of the way, we can begin with the rules. As I mentioned before, the selection will be divided into 3 days with ample rest between these stages. We will provide adequate medical attention during these rest days, but during a tournament day, you can only rely on yourself. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. This means there will be a ban on all extracurricular supplements. The only thing you can rely on is your own force and force replenishment ability. Those found violating this rule will be disqualified immediately. Orinik didn't explain how he would monitor such a thing when there were so many participants, not to mention countless elders with a vested interest in their juniors succeeding, but no one doubted his confident expression. If the Void Palace couldn't accomplish at least this much, they would be far too incompetent. The first day will be a group stage. The second day will be a round robin. The third day will be a special day which has an undecided format as of now. As I've already stated, this is just the beginning. Whether you will truly become the students of the Void Palace will be decided on how you perform when you reach those tall gates. However, there is still something that you can fight for here. There are an unlimited number of nominal disciple positions. Whether you can claim one will depend on your performance. Those eliminated in the first day will have no chance. However, those who can make it into the second day can consider themselves to be on a short list of potential entries. Above the nominal disciple position, there are 3 gold tokens up for grabs. These gold tokens, when exchanged at the Void Palace, allow you a chance to directly challenge to become a galaxy-ranked disciple upon entry. Of course, reaching the location to do so is not so easy. But this is a matter you will learn about in the future. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Finally, there is the amethyst token. In this selection, there will only be one. However, just like the nominal disciple position and the gold tokens, this amethyst token also isn't guaranteed to be given out. Orinik allowed his words to drift into the air. He wanted those here to know that there was no guarantee that any of them would be selected. There was a very real possibility that even after all 3 days, not a single token would be given out and not a single disciple would be chosen. The amethyst token is a special token reserved for a special level of talent. Across the human domain, in a given selection cycle, no more than 2 or 3 has ever been given out at the same time. In fact, in most years, not a single amethyst token would be awarded. The amethyst token represents the undefeated. To earn this token, not only must you display dominance, you cannot lose. This token represents the number 1 genius of a sector, an undisputed ruler amongst their peers. Having this amethyst token, much like having the gold token, allows you to challenge for a higher disciple rank. But, while the gold token caps you at the galaxy rank, the amethyst token has no such cap. Whatever you accomplish will be solely up to you. The gazes of the youths all glowed with a fiery light. Just how many of them wanted to claim such a glory, to be undefeated and become the undisputed head of their generation? Visit. For a better user experience, fire burned in their chests and a blaze lit in their eyes. This glory, they would give their everything to strive for it. More coming, smiley face. Chapter 1151. Orinik's expression didn't change when he saw this, but he inwardly sneered. Orinik wasn't the kind of person to actively condescend. Or, it was more accurate to say that most who went to the Void Palace had had their arrogance beat out of them long ago. The focus of the Void Palace was presenting a single shield to the outside world. There was no individuality, no room for self-esteem and pride, there was only the task at hand and your role in said task. Despite its name and despite the prestige that came with being a part of them, the Void Palace was essentially the military. Nothing more, nothing less. To see all of these people being so excited already filled Orinik with one layer of disgust, as he too had once been one of them. But, seeing them actually pine over a reward as exclusive as the amethyst token was enough for him to want to vomit. Did they have any idea what kind of monsters had the right to grasp such a token? Even if you really did defeat everyone in your sector, if your competition was too weak, the overseer would never grant you such a badge. What good was it in being the best out of a group of trash? This was a sixth-dimensional sector and they actually thought they were worthy of such a thing? Was this a joke? Despite his feelings, Orinik remained silent. His force surged and he waved a hand. At that moment, an enormous billboard formed of motes of light appeared in the skies. It was entirely blank, but what was fascinating about it was that no matter what angle you looked at it from, it would feel as though it was matching your gaze dead on. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Lionel's eyes lit up when he saw it. It was yet another fantastic application of force arts and it left him fascinated once again. These days, he seemed to be finding crafting and the underlying force art mechanisms of it more and more amazing. Those who will be participating, send out a strand of your force toward this construct. If you cannot do at least this much, Orinik didn't bother to finish his words this time. He had used this line of reasoning numerous times already. He was sure that those present understood that he wouldn't be here to listen to their complaints and nonsense. Lionel's brow raised. Controlling force outside of yourself, or at least projecting your internal force outward, could quickly become very difficult. The billboard might have seemed close, but in order for it to be so large, and yet appear in everyone's vision so clearly, it had to be at least a few hundred meters in the air. Lionel could have never imagined projecting his force out so far before he grasped level 2 spear force. At least that was the case if he wasn't using his bow. Of course, since then, he had become far more skilled. In addition, after learning many of the Luxnix family's techniques, he had grasped many force manipulation techniques that would make this not too hard to accomplish. But this simple test made Lionel realize just how large the gap was. At that moment, an arrow shot into the skies. It streaked upward with a blazing speed before it pierced through the billboard above. Visit. For a better user experience while the arrow continued to fly higher before eventually rushing down below and crashing into the protective force arts that safeguarded the observers, the force that had coated it was completely stripped away. The billboard began to flicker and a long string of numbers appeared. 00000001. There was no name assigned to the number, but this didn't seem to matter. To the Void Palace, your name was meaningless until you became one of them. All the billboard checked for was your dimension and then tied you to a number. Haha. Number 1 it is. A youth with a boisterous laughter held up his bow proudly. He didn't seem to be from one of the 3 main families. In fact, he was from a family just beneath the main 3 and, on the surface, at the same level as Raya's sage family. His actions seemed to result in a cascade of events, numerous streams of attacks rushing toward the billboard as many hurried to get their spots. One number after another began to appear in the sky, each with their own unique force signatures. It seemed impossible for one person to impersonate another, even when they used the same exact force. Orinik's internal sneer only grew fiercer. He could sense many sixth-dimensional experts trying to squeeze themselves in. Though they masked it by using fifth-dimensional force, how could the Void Palace be so easily fooled? By now, dozens had tried, but each time, the billboard treated them like they were thin air. Visit. For a better user experience however. Ganner didn't have such patience. At that moment, a sweeping pressure suffocated the arena. Ganner, who had been lazily reclining on a throne-like chair on the ground floor of the arena, suddenly allowed his eyes to snap open. His palm reached out in a certain direction and the shrill scream of a middle-aged man pierced through the ambience of the arena. Before this middle-aged man could react or even fight back, they found their neck firmly grasped by Ganner's hand. "Ah. And no. I'm sorry." The middle-aged man could barely squeeze out those words, but the moment they did, Ganner clamped down. Many of those spectating had never seen something so horrible. A gushing rush of blood shot up from the middle-aged man's neck, his eyes popping out and his face doubling in size before his head imploded. Blood and gore sprung out in every which direction, but not a single piece seemed to land on Ganner at all. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. The galaxy-ranked disciple tossed the corpse to the side and sat back down, yawning and closing his eyes. Orinik shook his head and sighed. "If you want to keep your lives, I'd advise you stop trying." Chapter 1152. Lionel's gaze narrowed, but he didn't say much. In truth, he thought it was a bit unfair. Not everyone had the ability to be aware that they should restrain themselves within the fifth dimension, and even less knew of the diverging paths upon reaching the pinnacle of the fifth dimension. The difference being laid out before them now wasn't one of greed or overestimation, it was just one of class differences. These people simply weren't lucky enough. This was the first time the selection had been so open, and many of those who had tried just now were geniuses in their own right who never got a chance at a quota. Now that things had suddenly been open when they thought their turn would never come, Lionel could understand how they felt. If he wasn't born to such parents at the perfect time, would he have this chance laid out before him? If the Void Palace was so interested in gathering talents, shouldn't they have made a better effort? Why were there quotas, and why did they allow powerful families who were inherently selfish to begin with control them? As Lionel was thinking this, there was another individual with a dark expression. Visit. For a better user experience, if Meal didn't realize by now that what he had done was unnecessary, he would be too much of a fool. He had only gone so far because he had been present during previous selections, and even with his talent often being clearly better than that of those who participated, he never got a chance himself. He didn't want his daughter to go through the same thing, but how could he have expected that this year would be so open and free for all? Despite his fury, Meal's expression gave nothing away. He didn't cast any enraged glances, nor did he lose his cool. With things being this way, it was even better for Aina. Even if she would take on a small stain, so long as she performed, there would be nothing the Viola family could do to her. At the same time, Meal marked this memory in his heart. It wasn't easy for everyone of Earth to complete this task. Some even required a few pointers from Roja before they managed to succeed. Lionel could tell that this had taken a toll on many of them. They had been so eager previously, but seeing how thousands had accomplished something they all struggled mightily with, whatever eagerness they had had was tempered down dramatically. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. They suddenly felt that the odds of them making it to the second day had gone down significantly. This sort of competition. Maybe it was too soon for them. Didn't it take decades for many to make it through the fifth dimension? They had just entered. Maybe they were in over their heads. Lionel fell silent as he felt the shift in the atmosphere. As a leader, there was a lot of things he could do, but giving people confidence they didn't or shouldn't have wasn't one of them. Something like self-belief had to be earned and trained. Often, those who had it without putting in such effort were simply overestimating themselves. A lot of things had gone too smoothly for the people of Earth. Compared to the people of the Milky Way, their talent was so much greater that how strong their foundations were never really mattered. And, even when the people of other galaxies invaded, much of the brunt of the work was honestly handled by Lionel, Noah, and the other preeminent talents. Being faced with the reality now hit them all hard. Even Lionel's own brothers hadn't found the task easy to complete. Only Drake had a relatively easier time, but that was only because he was a marksman to begin with. This time, Lionel chose to remain silent. He didn't give them encouraging words, nor did he try to cheer them up. Sometimes, a person would only be able to convince themselves of what they needed. Lionel's gaze shifted and landed on Elther. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Even compared to Noah, Elther had been greatly silent during this whole journey. After all, this was his first time hanging out with so many humans at once. It only made it more awkward that the Void Palace was meant to be the protectors of the human domain, so how exactly did he fit into all of this? Of course, Lionel had already thought of this and asked his grandmother about it. According to Roja, the Void Palace wasn't completely devoid of non-human species. There were many guardian beasts and the like, as well as a few rare humanoid species like the oryx. Though it wasn't common, it wasn't unseen either. That much allowed Lionel to rest easy and worry about Elther a bit less. Right now, though, Elther seemed to be in his element. Seeing so many powerful enemies before him, and seeing such a tall mountain to climb, his heart beat wildly, his gaze locking on to the stages ahead as though he couldn't wait to hop on. Right then, the billboard formed of motes of lights calmed. The instant this occurred, the numbers began to flicker, rearranging themselves swiftly until several columns were formed. Then, a large number of numbers dimmed while a single group of them glowed brightly. Those who can sense their auras glowing above, step forward. The first group match will begin now. Elther stood almost too quickly, a bestial aura rolling off of him in waves. His excitement was practically palpable, his handsome, almost otherworldly features, gaining a menacing and devilish charm to them. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. He shot forward, appearing on the arena. At some unknown time, an enormous saber had appeared in his hands, a pervading aura of thick darkness hanging around him. This was what Elther had always dreamed of. While others thought it might be nice to win the amethyst token, he wanted it and was willing to give up anything to get it, even if he had to cut his heart out of his chest. There was nothing he wanted in life more than to become the greatest general there ever was. Today, he would leave his first mark on the world. Chapter 1153. The appearance of Elther and his bloodthirsty aura seemed to cause something in the surroundings to shift. Even with how human Elther's face seemed, his tall and branching white horns stood out like a sore thumb. However, he didn't seem to care about it all in the slightest. Within the oryx, there were two things a man could take pride in. The first was their smell. Out of consideration for the humans around him, Elther had always restrained his own and even masked it quite well. However, this second pride was one thing he had absolutely no intention of hiding. The mark of an oryx male, the pride of a prince of the oryx kingdom, his horns. The stage slowly filled with participants. After the initial shock of Elther's appearance and his momentum, many calmed. Right now, Elther was only at tier 1 of the 5th dimension, even a step or two behind a few of Earth's geniuses, let alone those that were here. Even the weakest of the participants were tier 4 and 5. Elther quickly fell to the bottom of his bracket. The greatest shame was that there was no one else of Earth chosen with him. Though the odds were low considering the sheer number of participants, it was now certain that Elther would be on his own. Hey. What exactly are you? Did your mom fuck a deer or something? A familiar young man stood forward, curiously observing Elther from top to bottom. He was none other than 00000001, the archer who acted first. Being a member of the Arundo family, he was quite confident in himself. Much like every other genius from a family just beneath the heel of the Viola, Montex, and Luxnix, they all believed they only needed just a single chance to shoot by them in a single step. He wasn't the strongest genius of the Arundo, but he was definitely up there. If an equivalent rank was made, he would be like the rankers of the Luxnix arms, probably in the top 100. Of course, that was only if the Arundo were taken into consideration. Whether he could replicate such a feat if he was a Luxnix. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. What did you just say? Elther's gaze narrowed. His saber hovered just above the platform they all stood on. However, if one looked closely, after Osran of the Arundo family spoke these words, the slightest twitch of Elther's wrist had caused the blade to nick the hard stone. The touch was so subtle and almost imperceptible that no one noticed, but the force that coated the blade cut through the stone so smoothly that not a single sound was made. To Elther, his mother was a great taboo. For as long as he could remember, it had always just been him, his father and his brothers. To birth a child with affinities for force as powerful as Lionel's Scarlet Star Force or Elther's Chaotic Particle Force took a lot out of a woman. Though Elther was birthed with an ability rather than an innate node, and the difficulty was lesser as a result, it still wasn't a smooth process by any stretch. While Lionel's mother almost died, Elther's own wasn't so lucky. Though Elther's father and his brothers never blamed him nor made him feel like he was to blame, it was still a weight he carried with him. It might very well be why he was so independent as a child, always insisting on forging his own path. For this Osran individual to dare to say such a thing to him. Begin. The final 3 will make it to the second day. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience Sorenix voice fell, uncaring for the squabbles of those on the platform. Even though there were just over 100 on the stage now, he had seen too many die in the Void Palace, all of whom were hundreds of times more powerful than the few before him. He had seen hundreds just as eager and willing as Elther as well, but weren't they all buried just the same? What did it matter? Ho ho ho, you've got a temper, huh? Did that come from the beast side of your family? Osran laughed. Bang! Elther had already vanished from his spot. His enormous saber trailed him like the tail of a comet lit by black light. Osran sneered, his bow having already appeared in his hands and 2 arrows having already been knocked. With movements as fluid as water and as easy as breathing, Osran glided backward as he released his arrows. Unlike Elther, Osran had a few members of his own family present. They entered a loose formation together, leaving the former to Osran while they targeted the remaining members of the group. Almost immediately, the group stage was divided into several cliques. Those who had less to rely on immediately voiced complaints, but Orinik turned a blind eye to them all. Hadn't he already said clearly there wouldn't be absolute fairness? Elther, though, didn't seem to care. A bestial aura continued to rise from him, the pores of his skin opening and closing as the white fur of his battle fur advanced and retreated. As furious as he was having trouble keeping it all under perfect control, but that did nothing to slow his speed in the slightest. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, his saber glided forward, splitting Osran's 2 arrows despite their speed and appearing outside the encirclement of their loose formation. Osran's smile faded, his expression becoming a touch more serious. He hadn't expected a Tier 1 to deal with his arrows so easily. But, he still didn't panic, his force surging. He realized that this wasn't a place for him to fool around. Since he had caused this mess, he would deal with it quickly. Osran knocked an arrow, his force surging. The arrow seemed to double in size in an instant, a wild and untamable silver force wrapping around it with a vicious piercing light. Osran took just a half-second to prepare this attack. He could already see Elther's head being skewered through. But, to his shock, he never got to release it. Elther suddenly vanished, his speed suddenly exploding forth. The last thing Osran saw was the menacing glare of a beast and a row of sharp, glistening teeth. Elther's saber swung downward with such speed that nothing seemed to happen even several moments afterward. It was only after a light gust of wind blew by that Osran fell into 2 halves, a bloody pool forming and filling in the cracks between the tough stones. The first blood of the tournament had been drawn. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Chapter 1154. A mad howl left Elther's lips, a wild dark elemental force surging about his body. The members of the Arundo family were instantly caught off guard. They had only formed their formation on a whim and hadn't really considered its flaws. Elther's explosion and speed wasn't something they were able to react to appropriately, leaving them at a loss. Light elemental force was well known for a few of its abilities. Its speed, its piercing ability or its ability to solidify and concentrate, and its healing ability. Though these things could vary depending on the exact type in question, these were general abilities all light elemental forces seemed to share. Dark elemental force, however, was different. It was known for its concealment ability, its heaviness, its looseness and gaseous-like form, and, for lack of a better term, its cursing ability. If these things were to be summarized, it would be that light elemental force was good at giving something of itself, while dark elemental force was good at taking for itself. In that moment, while it felt like Elther's speed had increased explosively, what had actually happened was that everyone around him had slowed down. The same had even happened with Osrin's arrows, but the effect was so perfectly timed that even Osrin himself didn't seem to have noticed the change. The shock of the Arundo immediately shifted to fury. They might have been second to the three main families, but that didn't change their view of themselves. To the rest of this sector, they were still noble and esteemed. To have one of their own killed before them like this was a great humiliation. Unfortunately, their rage didn't seem to move the needle one way or another. As for why, that was because Elther hadn't finished venting either. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Blood flowed down the stage, a singular young man standing at the center. Elther's white hair seemed particularly blinding amidst all the crimson, his breathing moving with a labored rhythm. Though 3 had been meant to pass on to the next round, the actual number seemed to just be 1. Orinik didn't seem too fazed by this result. He would just give the spot to the last 2 to be cut down, if they could survive, that is. As for the rest of it, it had nothing to do with him. There was a furious sort of atmosphere permeating around the arena. Though Elther hadn't killed everyone in his group, there were quite a number that had been cut down, never to rise up again. While a few that had lost out fled the stage, many more would never see another sun rise. Did Elther feel bad? Not at all. To him, this was no different from a battlefield. If you didn't have the resolve to die, then don't step foot upon this place. Elther had been on many battlefields in his life. Compared to these noble young men and women who lived lives of mostly leisure, he had a different sort of edge to him. That edge was what allowed him to see the air of a veteran of war hanging around Orinik. Maybe even faster than Lionel had, Elther realized that this wasn't a joking matter, nor would making it into the Void Palace be all sunshine and rainbows. From here on out, they would wade through a sea of corpses. If those here couldn't clear this trial, they would still find themselves dead eventually. Elther slowly walked off the stage, his gait quite slow and his face a bit pale. Though he had won, he was still only Tier 1. And, for the sake of the second day ahead, he had refrained from using his trump cards, making things even more difficult on him. Visit. For a better user experience, a cascade of boos suddenly began to fall from the crowd above. Seeing Elther win wasn't just something the Arundo family didn't want. As humans, they disliked the idea of someone of another race taking such a resounding victory against them. Despite his handsome face, with the exception of a few swooning women who had fallen for his devilish charm, Elther very easily became public enemy number 1. If not for fear of the Void Palace disciples and the actions of Ganner earlier making many too apprehensive to step out of line, they might have started throwing things from their stands as well. Elther inwardly shook his head. Though his father had let him come with Lionel, Elther knew his old man quite well. With how stubborn he was, the likelihood that he would allow the Oryx to follow Lionel was very low. Of course, this wouldn't be about being untrusting of Lionel, but mostly just an understanding of objective reality. Just look at how these people were treating him just because he was a bit different. Compared to his Oryx counterparts, he was about as close to human as you could get. From him, it only became worse from then on. If they couldn't even accept him, how would they accept the others? Even knowing that the Oryx only had their best chance to maximize their hyper-evolution state under Lionel, his father still chose to go his own way. And, seeing such a reception, Elther couldn't blame him. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Elther felt a shadow wash over him. He looked up to find a smiling face looking back at him. You did good. Your saber needs some work, though. You wasted way too much energy swinging it around like that. Elther was speechless. Lionel stood before him, grinning as though he couldn't see or hear anything around him. Without a care, he critiqued Elther's battle and wrapped an arm around his shoulder. For a long time, Elther didn't quite know how to respond. He opened his mouth several times, but nothing seemed to come out. He had been by Lionel and the rest of the Earth geniuses for the past several weeks, but he had never really made an effort to ingratiate himself with them. He always felt that there was a barrier he could never cross over. But, seeing Lionel act like this, he suddenly felt a bit of guilt in his heart. Despite knowing he'd put a target on his back by doing this, Lionel had still stepped out without a care. Elther was quite absent-minded, so much so that he didn't even realize that it wasn't just Lionel. Looking up, he suddenly realized that everyone of Earth had come out with wide grins on their faces. Visit. For a better user experience. Chapter 1155. Who are these people? Within the Arundo family, a young man with a dark expression sat, staring out toward the heart-warming meeting between Elther and the other geniuses of Earth. Of course, in the perspective of others, this was anything but a wholesome moment. He would have liked nothing more than to put an arrow between their brows. Osran wasn't a person he knew personally. In fact, on a normal day, Osran wouldn't even be worthy of carrying his shoes. However, in this sort of situation, things were very different. Every action made by a member of the Arundo family, especially when the person was as high profile as Osran to begin with, was a potential boon or blight on their reputation. To a high-level family, reputation was very important. Though it wasn't exaggerated as a saying like perception was reality, it wasn't very far off. When a family grew as large as the Arundo, they actually entered quite a precarious state. They had so much territory to govern, rule and, most importantly, protect. In such a situation, their soft skills became far more important than how large their fists were. Even the Luxnix family experienced such a thing, or else they wouldn't have gone into such a state of hibernation for 3 generations. To make a complicated matter simple, the stronger your front as a family, the more battles you could avoid because those far weaker than you would know not to waste your time. Visit. For a better user experience as an example, take the Arundo's territory. They might very well have dozens of much smaller families surrounding them. Under normal circumstances, due to the prestige the Arundo family had built up, these lesser families would never deign to attack them. The reality was that even if these families did all attack at once, the Arundo would still be able to deal with them. But, such a thing would result in the Arundo stalling their growth phase and wasting resources. The sturdier front a family put up, the less they would have to deal with such things. It was in the same way a chess grandmaster would know to resign when a game reached a certain point because they had trust that their opponent would be able to close out the game properly. If the prestige of the Arundo family took a hit, though, and people began to believe they lacked the skill to close out the game, it would begin to breed trouble. The operative word was deterrence. Only with strong enough deterrence could a family occupy large amounts of territory while withstanding the least amount of pressure. Of course, the youth who spoke was one of the Arundo family's 2 candidates for their crown heir position, Isaac. Much like the others of the Arundo, he too was a bowman, and, unsurprisingly, he felt that his performance in these selections would decide whether he became the crown heir or not. We don't know who they are, but there are some rumors. Visit. For a better user experience, another youth of the Arundo family rubbed his nose. He had quite a mischievous streak between his eyes as he seemed amused that Isaac wasn't as well informed as he was. Of course, the only person who dared to do this was Isaac's rival for crown heir, Isaac. Stop beating around the bush, this matter involves us both. I don't know about you, but I have no intention of inheriting a laughing stock of a family. Isaac snorted, clearly not enjoying his distant cousin's lack of a sense of humor. It had always been this way. Isaac was the more social of the two, and though he was slightly less powerful, he had the far better social network. On the other hand, Isaac was the stronger one, something Isaac accepted, but he lacked the skills a patriarch should have. He didn't know how to speak to people or manage people. He didn't even know about something so important happening. This said, the relationship between the two wasn't so bad. Not every crown heir duo or trio was at each other's throats like Richard and Gradier had been. Though, that was also because Isaac was quite easygoing while Isaac was quite simple-minded. Still, Isaac was right on this one. They were indeed a united front on this matter. There was news that came a few days ago that there was a huge commotion that went down at the Luxnix estate. There were even reports that a pillar of light was viewable from outer space. There's been a muddying of the details, but it seems to all revolve around one name, Lionel Morales. Visit. For a better user experience, huh? Isaac didn't seem to understand. Isaac rolled his eyes. Lionel Morales, the name of the boy the Luxnix had stricken from their family records. There were even rumors resurfacing about him in the last few months. I thought it was just some political scheme to deal with the Luxnix, but it seems there were rumors because he's back. Isaac's gaze narrowed. What is that supposed to mean? We can't get revenge because he's a Luxnix? Isaac was at a loss for words. What is in that head of yours? Didn't I just say his name was stricken from the records and that there was a huge commotion caused at the family? And, didn't you see that the Luxnix arrived but he wasn't among them? I'm thinking that they only got such good seating arrangements because of that granny over there. It seems his grandmother was one of the Luxnix family elders before they broke off from the family. So, he's free game. In fact, they're all free game. The light in both potential heirs' eyes lit up, murderous intent pervading from them. They might have been two opposing individuals, but they stood on the same side when it came to what they wanted for their Arundo family. At that moment, the billboard of motes of light had already shifted once more. Those that had failed had their names completely erased while a new set of individuals was highlighted. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Ah, it seems like it's my turn. Alina nervously stood, walking toward the arena under the encouragement of the other people of the moon. Chapter 1156. Alina fluttered onto the stage with her heart nearly beating out of her chest. She seemed quite delicate and frail despite her more than average height for a woman. But this was just an unfortunate part of being born and raised on the moon. Her bone structure was more fragile than normal and she had to compensate with her use of force. Luckily, thanks to the metamorphosis, a lot of her deficits had been made up for. But, at the moment, she was at yet another great disadvantage. Of the forces, water elemental force was probably the most fickle. The density of it varied wildly depending on how close to a water source you were, how long it had been since the last time it rained, and what sort of climate there was. As a person whose most powerful tool was her water elemental ability, Alina today was much weaker than she had been on the ocean's surface that day. However, Elther's performance had given her courage. Who said she couldn't win just because she was weaker than those around her? Very quickly, all those called upon found their place in the ring. After the first battle, the nervous air was several times greater than it had been before. All those here were keenly aware that their lives might be forfeit at any time. Alina calmed herself, steadily accumulating the water force in her surroundings. Suddenly, she felt several sharp gazes land on her, causing her brows to wrinkle. She looked up to find several individuals wielding bows looking right at her. It didn't take her a genius to realize why it was they were giving her such looks. Alina immediately went on the defensive. Begin. Visit. For a better user experience this time, the battle didn't start instantly. Wary eyes looked around, inching toward the edge of the arena to ensure that they couldn't be stabbed from behind. Unfortunately, some unlucky souls realized that they were surrounded from all sides and couldn't easily retreat. They kicked themselves for being so careless in stepping onto the platform so casually. This lull, though, only lasted for just a moment. On the sidelines, Lionel's brow knit. There were less Arundo family members in this bracket, just 3, compared to last time. However, if they insisted on targeting Alina like this, it would be a problem. Alina wasn't some spring flower. She had fought 2 wars and had been on the front line of the battle against Earth's oceanic creatures. The issue was that she was outclassed by Dimension Tier here, and she was outnumbered. A low and delicate shout left Alina's lips, her accumulating water force erupting to form an enormous sphere of blue around her. She immediately surrounded the sphere with twin rivers of water, lashing out against the oncoming arrows. Bang! 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 Alina's expression paled as she slid backward, large amounts of her water force dispersing. She quickly refocused her attention, diverting one portion toward the accumulation of more water force and another toward monitoring her surroundings. Alina knew that she had a weakness in movement technique, but she was very good at control. With this came a powerful internal sight, though not as exaggerated as one might expect to find with a Luxnix. Still, splitting her attention into 2 like this wasn't a problem. Unfortunately, what she quickly found was that her only enemy wasn't the Arundo. The Arundo were only one of the major families Elther had offended with his killing spree, and it was no secret to anyone in the arena that Alina was tied with him. Visit. For a better user experience, a youth approached Alina from the side, swinging toward her sphere of water. Alina reacted quickly. While it appeared to be a sphere, the reality was that a portion of it had sunk into the ground. Taking advantage of the cracks and the flexibility of water, Alina had set up a spiderweb trap of sorts in the ground around her. Unfortunately, she hadn't had enough time to make it as powerful as she could, but it would have to do for now. The youth was completely caught off guard, howling in pain as a spike of water force drilled through the sole of their feet. Having had their mind blinded by the torturous wound, the youth couldn't even react as a whip of water blasted them from the arena. At that split moment of Alina's attention being taken, though, several arrows had already appeared before her. Bang! 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 Alina couldn't react in time to use her rivers, resulting in the arrows directly colliding with her sphere of protection. Panic colored her features as the arrows tore through, but her shield was just thick enough to slow the arrows to a crawl. They fell to the ground with dull clangs. However, Alina had been completely shaken. Of the 3 arrows, one had been aimed right for her forehead, another had been aimed right for her heart, and the last had been aimed right at her womb. Visit. For a better user experience, each was more sinister than the last, and it made her feel that her life had been sucked dry. By the time she realized her shield had been just barely enough to block them and she snapped out of it, she was horrified to find that several more attacks were coming her way. Another attack came from her left, this time wielding a glaive. Her right side, which she had just cleared, had already been filled by yet another. And, right down her middle, a chorus of 3 more arrows sliced forward, right toward the holes in her water sphere that had yet to heal. Finish. Alina was at a loss for words. She had hardly been able to fight the battle she wanted to fight. She had just managed to drum up her courage to face these behemoths, but how had things ended this way? Maybe she wasn't one of the lucky ones after all. Fall off the stage. At that moment, Lionel's voice seemed to cut through all the noise. Like a pointed roar, it shook her psyche awake. Not everyone could remain calm in the face of death, and they might even forget solutions they could easily think of in any other situation. Alina had completely forgotten she was so close to the edge of the stage. But by the time she registered Lionel's words, it was too late. Even if she fell back now, those arrows wouldn't be stopped, they would still strike true. There was no way to survive this. Damn it. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. If Alina could see through this in her flustered state, how could Lionel not? When he yelled out, he had already moved. However, it was then another booming voice descended. You dare? Oranic's voice cast a shadow over the arena. Chapter 1157. Oranic's expression was as dark as the night, fury marked between his brows. He hadn't thought that anyone would actually be so brazen as to interfere with the proceedings, especially after both he and especially Ganner had made it clear who held authority here and who didn't. Did he understand why Lionel was moving? Yes. Did he care about what that reason was? Absolutely not. Death was an inevitable part of these selections. There was a reason he hadn't done a single thing as Elther killed as he pleased. If anyone dared to try to stop Elther previously, he would have killed them on the spot. For Lionel to dare to do something like this before him. He was courting death. Lionel, however, had a vastly different perspective. He didn't care about the prestige of the Void Palace, nor did he care about Ornik's authority. All he cared about was the fact that Alina was a woman who had put her life on the line to save his brothers just several weeks ago. If he stood by and did nothing as she died, he wouldn't even be able to look the people of the moon in the eye. Lionel didn't want to put his grandmother in a situation where she had to take action. His movement and her movement held completely different weights. He was still a member of the younger generation and his actions could be left as a slight against Ornik himself. However, if his grandmother made a move, it wouldn't be a matter of youths any longer, it would be a slap to the face of the Void Palace itself. Among the geniuses of Earth, Lionel knew that he was the only one with the speed to make it. So, he took it upon himself. However, the moment Ornik spoke, an oppressive aura fell like a hammer. It crashed against Lionel's head and threatened to bury him into the earth. The difference in this aura from what Lionel had experienced before in the past was like night and day. Even Sparking Star Order had no ability to match it. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience right then, though, Lionel's gaze flashed with a blinding violet light, a deep crimson hidden within suddenly lashing out and causing Ornik's aura to splinter like shards of glass. Lionel's body flickered with bronze runes, his figure stepping through space and appearing by Alina's side and within her water sphere in the blink of an eye. Wrapping an arm around her waist, he stepped and pulled backward, his free hand tapping forward 3 times in quick succession. His arm moved so quickly that it left afterimages in the air, almost making it seem like he had 4 arms instead of just 2. Clang! 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 The arrows deflected off of Lionel's fingers like they had rammed into a metal wall, causing even Lionel to raise a brow. His bronze runes had already vanished as he had only needed to activated them for a moment to boost his spatial affinity for an instant, but he was surprised by the strength of his body. In fact, now that he thought about it, he had miscalculated the amount of effort he would need to get here as well. With soft steps Lionel landed with Alina by his side, splashes of water landing around them as Alina looked around shaken, her face as pale as a sheet of paper. Are you all right? Lionel's brow furrowed, looking toward Alina. Yes. Yes, I'm all right. Visit. For a better user experience, Alina's voice trembled. She had faced death before, especially during her fight with the 3 whales. But never had it felt so close until now. It wasn't just that she faced death, it really felt like she had died for a moment. The entire arena seemed to freeze over as Ornik's gaze locked onto Lionel. The battle on the stage came to a grinding halt, no one certain of what to do any longer. At that moment, a torrent of boos rang down from the crowd above. They all felt they were rightfully pissed. It was fine when Elther killed people, but not when others wanted to kill Alina. Was there anything so good in this world? Do you treat my words as air? Lionel, who had been making sure that Alina was all right, only now turned toward Ornik. And what words are those? Lionel asked. Clearly not expecting to receive such an answer, Ornik's expression became fiercer. Ganner, who had been lazily reclining on his own chair, leaned his head on his palm, opening his eyes to reveal a gaze as sharp as a blade. Do you think this is your playground and you can do as you please? Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience, how did I do as I pleased? I saved a friend of mine, so just disqualify her and continue with the round. I've done nothing to interfere with your process, nor did I take out anyone who didn't deserve to be taken out. So it's fine for your people to kill others, but they can't be killed themselves? Ornik hadn't expected to get into a shouting match with a junior. In fact, he would have already acted had it not been for the fact he knew that Lionel's grandmother would never allow him to die. Orinik didn't fear the elder, but without knowing where his own superior was, he would rather not put his life on the line to fight this battle. If he died and the Void Palace only punished them afterward, it wouldn't be worth it. First of all, I never stopped anyone else from trying to save their people. They can only blame themselves for being too slow. Secondly, weren't you the one who said there was no such thing as absolute fairness? My friend has lost and won't receive a position to enter the Void Palace. Does that mean she also has to die? Is that how your Void Palace proves how macho they are? By forcing people who don't have to die to do so? Aina? Where are you going? Yuri, who was shocked by what was happening here, suddenly realized that Aina had stood. But Aina was headed away instead of toward the stage. Visit. For a better user experience, I don't know, I don't like this. I'll be back when it's my turn. Her voice was just as unmoving and lacking in substance as it had been for the past several months. Chapter 1158. Yuri and Savon looked toward one another. The stress between their brows was almost too obvious for all to see. It felt like they were a pair of mothers trying to care for their child, but the problem was that this child had the strength to flatten a mountain with a single stomp of her feet. Was it jealousy? Maybe it was a bit of that. But, from what Yuri and Savon understood about the situation, it was very likely that Aina was seeing something beyond that, something that she simply hated to see. Once again, Lionel was putting himself at risk for the sake of saving someone else. How many times had she already seen something like this? The trouble here, though, was the fact that they weren't sure what this meant for Aina's personality. Was it returning? Or was it a childlike temper tantrum triggered by something unknown? It was simply too hard to tell, and this wasn't exactly a situation where they would be able to tell either. The two worriedly looked toward Lionel. Even if it wasn't for Aina, they wouldn't want to see Lionel die here. But, if he really did die, who knew how it would affect Aina? Hearing the clear taunt in Lionel's words, Orinik's fury was at risk of tipping completely over. Leave it be. The sudden voice was like trickling rainwater, delicate and echoing. It was soothing to an almost impossible degree, and yet it washed over the arena with a momentum that made many freeze. The power behind it was so undeniable that no one seemed to even think of imagining the kind of beauty behind these words. Just the thought alone felt blasphemous. It was suddenly obvious to everyone present that Orinik, Ganner and the others were only the face of what the Void Palace had presented. The true brawn hadn't bothered to appear. Maybe precisely because they were unworthy. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, the only one who furrowed his brows at this voice was Lionel. There was something odd and artificial about it. Though the voice sounded beautiful, he was of the opinion that it would sound even better if it wasn't so strained. Of course, he had no idea that his mother had changed the pitch of her voice slightly in the off chance that Lionel would recognize it. It seemed that she was right to be so cautious. Maybe only Lionel would be sharp enough to parse apart the difference. Lionel recovered quite quickly and nodded in thanks to seemingly empty air. Only after this did he lead Alina away and allow the rest of the second round to continue. Quite expectedly, no one dared to replicate what Lionel had done. The voice of the woman was like an imprint on their soul. She might have forgiven such a thing once, but who was to say that she would do so again? You didn't manage to stop him? Ganner looked toward Orinik, who had returned to their seating arrangements. The truth was that if Orinik had been standing near the stage, Lionel would have never been able to save Alina, at least not in time. However, because he hadn't seen much of a point in forcing himself to stand for the entirety of this day, he chose to return and sit, allowing the billboard to handle everything else. Unfortunately, this put him on the opposite side of the arena to where Lionel had come from, so he could only use his aura. He had thought it would be enough, but he couldn't have possibly expected that Lionel would be able to ignore it. Orinik's expression darkened, but he didn't give an answer. Ganner's lazy gaze had likewise become quite sharp. Despite his usual demeanor, he took his role in the Void Palace quite seriously as well. If not for their overseer saying something, they would have acted as well. It won't happen again. I didn't expect someone to actually be so brazen. Next time, I will attack directly. Visit. For a better user experience, Sornik had wanted to disqualify Lionel and strip him of the right to participate, but after their overseer spoke, he would be looking down on her if he continued to pursue the matter. However, he would remember this. Why do you look so down? Lionel smiled. He patted Alina on the head, but she continued to look down at the ground. Unshed tears threatened to spill over. If she wasn't scared about being an even greater burden by crying, maybe she would have already failed to hold them back. Lionel sighed. We can't win everything. Even though you failed this time, won't there be a next time? Alina's shoulders trembled. She looked up to find Lionel's kind smile. Next time? Of course. Lionel reassured. Isn't the only requirement that you be below the 6th dimension? Right now, you're only at tier 2. Between now and the next cycle, how much will you grow? By then, who will be able to stop you? Hearing such words, Alina suddenly felt a lot better. She didn't want to be left behind by everyone else. Which of them here didn't have their own personal battle to fight? Her small hands closed into fists. 2 single streaks of tears fell down her cheeks as she forced a smile. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, yes, next time. She said resolutely. When the two made it back, Alina was immediately smothered by Joyce. As scared as Alina was to die, for a moment Joyce really thought she had lost her longtime friend. The two cried in each other's arms for a long while. Lionel took a deep breath, sitting by his grandmother's side. Grandma, am I too reckless? Lionel suddenly asked. Yes. Yes, definitely. Lionel smiled bitterly when he heard these words. But, he knew she was right. The trouble was, if he wasn't reckless, then who would be? There were certain things he couldn't just sit idly by and watch. These were his comrades and brothers and sisters in arms. He couldn't just let them die when he knew he could do something. Unfortunately, he knew that his actions had only painted an even larger target on the backs of the geniuses of Earth. One after another, the rounds passed by. Numerous so-called geniuses of Earth went up. But not a single one managed to pass. More coming later. Visit. For a better user experience. Chapter 1159. Lionel sat in silence as he watched his friends lose one after another, realizing that he was quite helpless to do anything about it. In truth, he blamed himself. He spent so long away from all of them that he never truly helped them to grow like he should have. He buried his head away, chasing a woman he couldn't even explain his attraction to and leaving them to fend against the dimensional verse on their own. He spoke of helping people, but he couldn't even properly help those closest to him. In fact, he had only made things harder on them. The mountain they would have had to climb to earn a spot to enter the Void Palace was tall to begin with, but now with this target painted onto their backs, and their number disparity, an improbable cause had instantly become an impossible one. There was not the slightest hint of remorse. Without fail, the geniuses of Earth were the first to be cut down every time. If not for Lionel wising up and giving them some protection before they went up, it was likely that each one would have died. Lionel's brothers didn't fare any better than the rest. They, too, found themselves on the losing end of their battles. Fuck. Franco kicked his chair over. It flew out with such speed that it shattered into wood splinters the instant it hit a wall. But, that didn't seem to make him feel any better. Visit. For a better user experience, losing wasn't something Lionel and his brothers were used to. They had been a team for so long and could count on 2 hands the number of games they had lost in that more than decade span. Yet, each one of them, no matter how far apart they were, hit just as bad. There was a heavy silence, a fury, a subtle feeling of inadequacy, all the confidence Elther had helped them build up deflated like a balloon. A gloominess that Lionel didn't know how to fix took hold, but with it came an underlying determination. Lionel knew well how his brothers responded to adversity. Giving them words of encouragement now would only undermine and insult them. He was certain that this sort of humiliation wasn't something that would happen again. At least not for a very long time. The billboard flickered once more, and this time, Noah stood, his gaze having long since turned from indifferent to cold. His gaze shifted over and met Lionel's. Though the two didn't exchange any words, their meaning was already clear. Noah's crystalline blue saber appeared long before he made it to the stage. His steps were even and measured while the sun seemed to dance off the edge of his blade. Every reflective light seemed to make those that saw it reflexively recoil, worried that one of these sharp rays might slice their neck clean off. Among those that had failed already, Jessica was among them. Her beast-taming ability was useless against these enemies as her pets were simply too weak and hadn't grown. On top of that, the wilderness of planet Luxnix was far too dangerous for even Lionel to travel through casually, let alone her. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience without a choice, she chose to not even summon her partners, resulting in her losing even faster than the others before her had. Though she returned gracefully and unwounded, without the same gloominess the others seemed to display, every time Noah sent a glance toward her he only seemed to become more infuriated. Jessica wasn't weak, nor were her beast partners. The reason she didn't dare to summon them was because she knew well that she would be ganged up on. It simply wasn't worth risking the help of her pets just to lose anyway, for as long as Noah could remember, Jessica had always followed by his side, a silent help and a right-hand woman that was simply irreplaceable. He had long since learned how to read the different shades of her placid expression. She looked indifferent now, but everything from the sway of her short-cut hair to the way she crossed her legs screamed to Noah that she was feeling sadness and guilt to the depths of her soul. Sadness because she had failed. Guilt because she couldn't follow in his steps. And it was all the fault of these people. Oh. Another one of you? Are you all still stepping up to get embarrassed? Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Noah slowly walked up the steps of the arena, seemingly having not heard the jeers of the Montex family member. His steps were silent and his blade lightly bobbed just above the hard stone flooring. Everything from his breathing to the beat of his heart was steady. Begin. Oranic's voice still fell indifferently. He didn't originally care enough about these proceedings to become invested, but he still found himself watching every time a person of Earth stood up. He told himself that this was to ensure that Lionel could never interfere again, but if he was honest with him, he got a sick sort of satisfaction watching them be wiped out one after another. The instant his voice fell this time, though, he felt that something was different. Bang! It was a sound the audience had heard many times before. But, this time, it was so strong and cacophonous that the sturdy stone platform themselves shattered, sprinkling into the air like shards of glass. Each one of Noah's steps were heavy and there was nothing remotely elegant about his movement. His body grew to 3 meters in height, his saber became as large as a door and his skin shimmered like diamond beneath the sunlight. He was like a rampaging titan, his limbs becoming like locomotives, crushing everything in his path. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. The soles of his feet shattered skulls, his blade bisected bodies, his fists crushed souls. Every heart-rending cry and spine-tingling snap of the bone resounded through the arena, painting a sensory image that would never be forgotten by those who witnessed it. Chapter 1160. Noah heavily stepped off of the stage, his body drenched in blood from head to toe, none of which was his own. The arena couldn't help but be silent outside of his heavy step. When Noah returned, Roja stood with a doting expression on her face. She couldn't help but start wiping Noah off. Seeing how nonchalantly his grandmother was treating so much blood, Lionel suddenly got the feeling that maybe his family wasn't so normal. The dichotomy of sweet, old grandmother, helping her grandson wipe down the lifeblood of his murder victims. Just what kind of world was he in right now? Lionel's lip curled into a smile. Though the gloominess hadn't vanished, he could feel that Noah had vented much of their frustration. There was only so much that Lionel could do himself. At some point them witnessing his own success wouldn't move the needle anymore. However, seeing someone else do it gave them more courage to believe that they could do the same. Though the geniuses of Earth continued to lose after this, and even more miserably at that because Noah had re-energized their enemies, they still returned with their heads held high and a fire lit within their gaze. None of these people knew that the Lionel and his friends had only just experienced their metamorphosis not even half a decade ago. To have already reached such a stage in a short period of time was something to be proud of. And there'd come a day where they wouldn't have to show pride in their defeat, but could instead do so in their victory. The events of the day continued to wane. Of the people of Earth, most had already gone up and lost, unfortunately falling short. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. However, there were some success stories nonetheless. Careless, the preeminent genius of the moon and a young man Lionel knew for his exceptionally high spatial affinity, managed to become the third person of Earth to claim their spot for the second day. His ability was devastating and one couldn't even approach him without fearing for their lives. Despite the fervor Noah had reignited, he still managed to weather the storm and claim his place. The next success story was more so of luck than of skill. But it was one that Lionel happily accepted nonetheless. Milan and Arnold were lucky enough to get drawn into the same group. Working together, Milan's defensive energy shield ability and Arnold's explosive palm ability, not to mention the latter's grasp of universal force, was the perfect tandem. What Lionel didn't notice was that Orinic's pupils had constricted into pinholes when he saw Arnold's use of universal force. It had to be remembered that originally, Arnold followed the same path of comprehending universal force as everyone else. He fused it with his palm force and made it one-dimensional. However, after his meeting with Lionel and the others, Lionel pointed him toward the more complete path of universal force after seeing his talent in it. Now, Arnold walked the same path of universal force that Lionel did. It was just that neither of them seemed to realize just how impossibly rare this path was, but Orinic, Ganner, and the other envoys of the Void Palace most certainly did. In fact, they had all but decided who would get the golden token after seeing this display. Visit. For a better user experience time continued to speed by. Unfortunately, outside of Elther, Noah, Careless, Milan and Arnold, no others made it. Compared to the accumulating numbers of the other families, it was quite pitiful. However, it wasn't terrible either. Finally, after dozens of rounds and thousands of participants, Lionel felt a subtle connection call out to him as the billboard flickered. Oh. Lionel looked up, finding the number he had claimed for himself shimmering brightly. It seems like it was finally his turn. With a light push off his chair, Lionel stood and stretched, his bones cracking. His mind and body both felt quite alert. After sleeping for over a month, he felt more energized now than he had in a long time. Almost the instant Lionel rose, many eyes fell onto him. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that ever since that incident of a few hours ago, many had been waiting for Lionel's turn. The skill he had displayed in that short time frame wasn't small, but it was still difficult for many to get a read on exactly what his limits were. This was mostly because by the time people realized that someone actually had the audacity to move against the wishes of the Void Palace envoys, Lionel was already more than halfway there. It was hard to tell if he was just that fast, or if he had just reacted long before anyone else had. But now, all of those questions would be answered. The people of Earth had been being targeted by proxy only because they couldn't get at Lionel. But now that he was here, Lionel's steps were a lot lighter than Noah's despite the both of them being extremely heavy. He landed softly, his bare feet feeling the cool surface of the hard stone. Visit. For a better user experience comparatively speaking, Lionel was very casually dressed. He didn't have a weapon in hand nor did he wear any armor. He wore a loose-fitting pair of sweatpants and a long-sleeved shirt that waved about in the wind, pulling against the toned silhouette of his torso. It was the kind of nonchalance that made those around him either furrow their brows or sneer. At that moment, the final contestant stepped forward, a curious glint in his eye. This young man was none other than Isaac, and his bow was already in hand. His piercing gaze landed on Lionel. As though a hawk, he scanned him up and down, the rest of his internal sight focused on his surroundings. This matter couldn't have been more perfect. Lionel and his people had slighted the Arundo. If Isaac defeated him, he would take a leg up on that distant cousin of his. But, he was still a cautious person. One scheme after another began to play in his mind. Isaac thought he was clever and calculated, but Lionel's mind was so clear at the moment that he could even count the steps of every insect within a kilometer radius right this moment. Such obvious glances weren't something he would miss. A bow. I don't think I need to use one here, though. Lionel thought to himself. Why don't we test out a few things instead? Lionel stood in the dead center of the arena, seemingly oblivious to the danger of his position. Begin. Visit. For a better user experience. Chapter 1161. Almost the instant Orynyx's words fell, Lionel was bombarded from all sides with a flurry of attacks. The people of the Luxnix family narrowed their eyes. Too many of them hadn't seen Lionel fight previously, and many only caught the tail end of what had happened. However, while news was cut off from the outside, the elites of the Luxnix were very well informed about what had happened that day. Right this moment, other than maybe Miguel, there wasn't a soul with Luxnix blood who wasn't paying very close attention, and that went doubly so for the members of the Luxnix who happened to be in the same group with Lionel. Lionel, though, felt as though his mind was working at speeds too fast for the world. For a moment, he just stood there, watching as these attacks charged toward him frame by frame as though it was all in slow motion. Lionel's hands slid into his pockets, his eyes slowly closing. Let's try. A strong surge of dream force coalesced around Lionel, his foot lightly tapping on the ground and causing a quickly expanding ring of dark gold to form. Bang! 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 Lionel was buried. A cascade of never-ending attacks drowned his body in a flurry of force of all kinds. The clashing of opposing and synergizing of like elements made the explosion all the more volatile, the entire center of the arena imploding into a rain of stone, rock and billowing smoke. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. However, right at that moment, a mighty roar sounded. It carried with it such a violent momentum that the smoke and dust cleared, shooting out and dispersing in all directions to reveal an enormous, 10-meter-tall, dark gold bear. Lionel stood leisurely on his bear construct's shoulders, unmoved and unfazed by what had happened around him. The bombardment of force sometimes rebounded and was sometimes swallowed by the thick fur and skin of the dark gold bear. Even its roar alone caused a rain of arrows to shatter and fly off like broken kites in the sky, leaving those who were left to witness it all speechless. Lionel looked down at his bear construct. Not bad, it was quite interesting. Compared to more static defensive mage arts, this bear was a bit special. It carried with it the elasticity unique to a living being, making it so that the rebound of attacks was less grating on Lionel. At the same time, its maneuverability in battle was several levels higher as well. Aim for him. Seeing Lionel standing on the shoulder of such an enormous bear shook many to their core. How could they not recognize the Luxnix force art system? But, they had never seen a Luxnix complete such a complex construct so quickly. That said, they knew the weaknesses of the Luxnix force art system. More complex didn't always mean better. Lionel's bear construct swiped a paw at the air, standing high on its hind legs as another billowing roar left its lips. But, its speed was too slow and many made it through, aiming right for Lionel. Lionel, though, seemed unmoved by this turn of events, his gaze glowing with a delicate pale violet light. He let out a slow breath, but the heat that came with it was so scorching that sparks of fire force lit in the air. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Those sparks erupted, forming miniature flames about Lionel, all for the high-pitched tweeting of birds to pierce the souls of all those who heard it. In one moment, Lionel was completely unprotected. In the next, dozens of hummingbirds with wings flapping so quickly they left nothing more than a blur in their wake appeared. They shot forward like guided missiles, piercing through the flurry of attacks aimed for Lionel with a spine-tingling precision and burning them up from the inside out. Boom! 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 Like kamikaze bombers, they crashed into the stone platform below, causing concentrated blasts of fire to erupt in all directions. Lionel stood on the shoulder of his bear construct, orchestrating the disaster. He never removed his hands from his pockets. In fact, he hadn't even moved a single inch since the battle began. One after another, he quick cast devastating arts, causing screams of agony and horror to echo endlessly. Isaac's pupils constricted. He had already organized several attacks, but none of them worked. Lionel seemed to see and plan out several steps ahead, and his casting speed was so fast that even if by some miracle you caught him off guard, it might not even matter. I'll do it myself. Isaac's gaze flashed, flipping his palm over to reveal a sleek arrow decorated from tip to tip in a complex array of runes. His gaze looked up, his force surging. Lionel's bear construct stamped a foot down, causing a ripple of earth to surge out in all directions, but Lionel himself remained unmoved. Visit. For a better user experience die. A blinding streak of silver shot through the skies. In the blink of an eye, it appeared just 3 meters from the side of Lionel's head. It was so fast that the bear construct couldn't possibly react in time. In fact, it was still stamping its feet, sending young geniuses sprawling and tumbling to the floor. Might be an interesting application of radiant force like this. Just when it seemed that Lionel would be pierced through, a blinding light appeared on his shoulder. Isaac barely had time to register the fact that this light had taken the shape of a silver bat before a shocking screech forced him to cover his ears. The bat's sonar sent ripples of concentric circles spiraling through the air, each ripple steadily getting larger. Isaac's arrow suddenly froze in the air, an astonishing pulse of magnetism stopping its ability to move forward any further. Then, it shattered completely, crumbling into little pieces as it fell from the sky. Unfortunately for Isaac, the ripples of sonar didn't stop. The high-pitched screech tunneled its way forward, crashing into Isaac in what felt like the blink of an eye. He thought that he would fly backward upon impact, but what actually happened made his eyes bleed as they reflected despair. Isaac. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. Bang! Isaac imploded, falling in a shower of blood, guts and gore. Chapter 1162. The members of the Arundo family all shot up. Even though this wasn't the first time a member of the Arundo family had died since this tournament began, it was most definitely the first time someone so high-profile had. Isaac's blood vessels threatened to shatter and pop. If not for several members of the Arundo dog piling him to force him down and back, there was no doubt that he would have already sprung into action, his full fury on display. Isaac tried his best to fight those that were on him off, but he was a bowman, not a Hulk. With so many having come together to stop him, and without him having the desire to kill them at all costs, he found his body almost buried into the ground. He could barely tilt his head up slightly, freeing just a single eye to focus on Lionel for all that he was worth. The white of his gaze pulsed with so many vessels that it practically turned red and rabid, his body trembling completely out of his control. But, in the end, he could only watch as Lionel's beast constructs vanished into motes of light, the entire arena empty of participants outside of himself. A pregnant silence took hold of the arena. There had been many battles before this, but none were ended nearly as easily as Lionel's own. They had thought that they might learn something about his speed from observing, when the reality was that Lionel didn't even have to move a single inch. The gap was so large that it felt like they had just watched an adult bully children. The Luxnick Star Order elders narrowed their gazes, watching Lionel walk away. They too hadn't witnessed the fight between Elodie and Lionel, but from what they knew, it lasted several exchanges and was quite heated, even though Lionel won in the end. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. With that bit of information, they had of course concluded that Miguel would win easily. The gap between Miguel and the three arm heads was so large that it might as well have been night and day. Seeing Lionel fight now, there wasn't anything he had just done that Elodie couldn't. Well, Elodie couldn't quick cast in such a fashion, but their meaning was that he would have won just as easily. Still, seeing Lionel's talent in action made them wonder just how far he could go. Lionel returned to the group with a light smile on his face. "You're such a show-off, Cap," Milan laughed. "Is that jealousy I hear?" Lionel's ears perked up. "Fuck you." Milan dove forward and tackled Lionel, but he found his arms swinging at air. By the time he noticed Lionel jumped over him, it was far too late. He crashed into the ground, skidding for a few meters. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. An eruption of laughter filled Earth's seating space. However, seeing the cheeriness of their atmosphere only made the fury smoldering within Isaac's soul burn even brighter. He had never felt so much rage in his life. But he had already had his turn and didn't even have anywhere to vent it. "Let me go. I'm leaving." Isaac's voice seemed to have dropped several octaves. Only after the others were certain that he was, indeed, leaving the arena did the rest of the Arundo relax. Amidst the Arundo elders, their patriarch sat with a stoic expression, watching as Isaac turned and left. It was impossible to tell what he was thinking by just his facial features alone, but he didn't seem to have reacted to Isaac's death at all. Inwardly, though, he felt that this was a turning point for his family. If Isaac could climb this mountain, maybe it would be exactly what his Arundo family needed to cross that final barrier and grow to match those three-pillar families. The events continued. By the time the end of the day began to roll around, countless geniuses had gone up. When it was Miguel's turn, one might have thought that he hadn't stepped onto the stage at all. Everyone ran around him as though they had blinders on, refusing to even think of attacking him. Visit. For a better _user experience, Miguel stood in silence, not bothering to make a move either. When just 3 individuals remained, he casually stepped off of the platform without a care in the world. The Luxnick's arm heads received the same treatment. By coincidence, the equivalent geniuses of the 3 leading families didn't meet, so their rounds ended just as easily and without fanfare. The likes of Savon and Yuri, surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly, also gained a spot for themselves. Savon was a talent of Earth and had been able to adapt on planet Viola for far longer than the others had, so her success wasn't too much to accept. As for Yuri, she was of mysterious origins to begin with and had always had more power than she displayed. Even after claiming a spot, she hadn't seemed to have gone all out. The Montex and Viola geniuses, of course, performed just as well. Though their deterrence wasn't as great as Miguel, they still received their due respect. Richard was among those that passed, only having to exchange 1 to 2 blows to properly display his might and prowess. Richard couldn't help but frown lightly when he stepped off of the platform when he looked toward where Aina should have been. She was absolutely nowhere to be seen. However, he turned his head away not long afterward. After giving up so much to earn a spot, he doubted that she would miss out on her chance. Finally, the day waned and the billboard flickered for the final time, its motes of light forming around the last list of names. As though a ghost, Aina appeared once more. When she stepped out and toward the arena, the crowd itself seemed to suck in a cold breath all at once. Visit. For a better _user experience this level of beauty. Was it even meant to be a part of their world? Chapter 1163. The current Aina didn't have the presence of maturity and elegance that a woman slowly reaching her prime should have. Her current mindset was quite infantile and she still hadn't quite grasped concepts of her own feminine wiles and charms. In addition, she had already learned to perfectly control her own mental coercion. After the shackles on her talent were released, she improved by leaps and bounds every day. And yet, none of it seemed to matter. For those here, this was the greatest beauty they had ever laid eyes on. Despite her indifference to the world, it only added to her charms, making her seem as though she had descended from another world entirely. The current Aina wore a flexible armor that wrapped around her curves almost too well, an enormous battle axe of red gold hovering to her back. Her every step carried its own explosive power, and the depth of black her armor and hair shared seemed to give her the tinge of a devilish vibe. Lionel fell into silence when his gaze landed on her again for the second time in a month. His expression didn't flicker and his arms remained crossed about his chest. He could tell with a single glance that she had improved vastly since he last saw her. Even after all his own improvements, he had next to no certainty of defeating her. In fact, he faintly felt that he might very well lose. It was a surprising conclusion for Lionel to come to, but it hardly moved the needle for him one way or another. After a month of rest, Lionel felt that he finally understood what bothered him so much about all of this. Objectively, he knew how he had hurt Aina. She was in a vulnerable point in her life and she was heavily reliant on him. That moment hadn't been the first time she got mad at him for risking his life for the sake of others. He had lost count of the number of times she had insisted that he should put himself first. Visit. For a better user experience, he and Aina had been clashing in this way even long before they made their relationship official. That day, when Lionel excitedly left the Mayan zone, eager to see her again, and she pierced a hand through Conrad's heart. Lionel knew that had been her way of waking him up to reality. Not only was she not solely that shy and timid girl he had known, but she was precisely the kind of cold-blooded murderer Lionel himself never wanted to become. Time and time again, they faced this exact clash. Even in the Joan zone, when Aina and he almost died because he was too soft with how he used his blade, even so far back they had always butted heads. Lionel knew this. He knew how she felt. So why had he reacted the way he had? The answer was so obvious that Lionel felt that he had been running away from it as opposed to chasing it like he should have been. All those years, Lionel had always been chasing after Aina, always doing the things she wanted, how she wanted to do them. He never batted an eye, never complained, and always followed along, happy just to be by her side. This wasn't a burden on him, and for him to pretend like it had been would be nothing more than revisionist history. He had been happy to do it. She was the woman he loved, the only woman he loved. To him, doing things for her wasn't a sacrifice, it was a pleasure, a privilege. However, when the day came that Lionel finally had something he wanted to fight for himself, a goal he wanted to aspire toward and chase. Rather than receiving the same sort of support he had always given Aina, what he received in return was doubt and insecurity. When Lionel told Aina about his dreams, about how he wanted to unite the dimensional verse and have her by his side as his queen, he didn't receive the eagerness and support he had been expecting. Instead, he received a questioning that he would have expected from a stranger or a person who didn't care about what his own hopes and aspirations were. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. He received the words of a person who didn't believe in him. That day, when Aina left him, it was just more of the same. Lionel understood how she felt, he truly did. She had gone through so much trauma in her life and didn't deserve any more. But, in his eyes, the fundamental root of it all was that she didn't believe in him. When Lionel met an opponent that didn't believe in him, he would just defeat them. When he met an enemy that didn't believe in him, he would just kill them. When he met a mountain no one believed he could climb, he would ignore those who looked down on him and climb it anyway. The one fundamental truth about himself was that he absolutely hated to lose. Maybe why he was so good at following his father's mantras of respect and persistence was exactly because of this. This was such a core part of who he was that he excelled in everything he did, even when it was something he didn't like very much. Maybe this was Lionel's own brand of arrogance, that deep-seated belief in himself that couldn't accept the speculation and doubt of others. The question, though, was what would he do when the person who didn't believe in him was someone he had given his heart to? How could he ignore her? How could he defeat her? How could he kill her? He didn't know the answer to that. So, visit. For a better user experience, he sat and watched as the love of his life wowed the crowd, her skills and movements breathing life into the world. He sat and watched as she cleared her group, easily claiming her spot with her back to him. He sat and watched as another man with a grin of pride on his face that should have been his own stepped before everyone, boisterously laughing as he pointed toward her. I want to thank the Montex and Luxnix family for allowing me this stage. Richard's voice boomed. Now that today's event has ended and there will be a gap between today and the second day's rounds, I would like to make an announcement to everyone. 2 days from now, my fiancée Aina Brazinger will be getting married. I invite all those in attendance today to bear witness to the first day of the rest of our lives. A certain shift took place in the atmosphere. Feelings of awe, worship and envy took hold. To have such a woman as a wife. Just how lucky was this Viola family crown heir? Finally. Lionel stopped watching, his eyes closing in peace. He finally had his answer. Now, he could let go. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. Author's note, I'll have to ask you guys to trust me, this won't end like you think it will. If you want books that can subvert tropes, you have to give an author a chance first, LMAO. Anywho, the main purpose of this note is to tell you guys that my birthday is tomorrow, so I won't be uploading. We'll be back the day after. Love you guys, love. Chapter 1164. There was a stunned silence that overcame the earth region of the arena. However, it was for just a moment. In the next instant, a fiery pillar of rage suddenly erupted. You bitch. Milan, Franco, Gil and Raj all charged forward as though they had lost their minds. Seemingly having expected this result, it was Joel, Arnold, Alan and Drake who leapt forward just a split moment afterward, diving for their waists and tackling them down. The 8 immediately ended up in a furious sort of dog pile. But, compared to the warmness such a thing had carried just a day ago, there was something decidedly sad about it this time around. It only seemed to make it worse that in all the commotion of the arena due to Richard's announcement, the commotion caused by these 8 was nothing more than a drop of water into a vast ocean. No one seemed to notice at all. No one except for Savon and Yuri, that is. Let me go. I held back enough. I'm going to tear them both a new asshole. Raj raged. Unfortunately, the clamp Arnold had on Raj was far too strong. He could hardly move and he didn't have the heart to use his ability on his brother. In the end, he could only squirm wildly, his gaze just as red as I6 had been just hours ago. Rija's eyes flickered with confusion. She didn't quite understand what was going on. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, she looked toward her grandson, only to see that his eyes were closed. If she didn't know better, she would think that Lionel was having a nap. It was then that she pieced everything together. That day when she saw the pain in her grandson's eyes, hidden beneath his coldness and indifference, this Richard and that Aina had both been present. Could it be that it was related to this? Was that why he had been feeling that way on that day? Coming to this conclusion, Rija's gaze also lit with fury. The murderous intent coming from her rose like the tides of a tsunami, threatening to drown the arena out in waves. It would only be a moment before everyone's attention was drawn, but Joel, Arnold, Drake and Alan all looked back toward Lionel. Of Lionel's brothers, there were 2 divisions. Raj, Milan, Gil and Franco had always been the jokesters. They had their own brand of humor, and if there was a joke being made, there was a 90% certainty that it was coming from one of them. On the other hand, Joel, Arnold, Drake and Alan were far more reserved. Joel was always the de facto leader of the group when Lionel wasn't present. Drake had meant to be Lionel's successor after he graduated from Royal Blue. Alan had an introverted personality, so much so that he didn't even show off his excellent physique, always wearing baggy clothing. And Arnold was a man of few words, even when he was communicating with Lionel himself. And yet, at that moment, they all looked toward Lionel with the same crimson gaze. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience, so long as Lionel gave the signal, no matter how high the odds were stacked against them, no matter how subtle such a signal was, they would immediately release Raj, Milan, Gil and Franco. In fact, not only would they release them, but they would be right alongside them, charging forth. To them, any slight against Lionel was a slight against them. They had been there before Lionel met Aina. They had been there before Lionel fell for her, before he spent years chasing after her. He had never shown any interest in any other woman. His admirers could have wrapped around earth itself, yet he had never bat an eyelash. They had always believed that Aina wasn't worthy of Lionel. Even when she revealed herself to be a world-toppling beauty, she left soon after, leaving a bad taste in all of their mouths. Now, they felt that things had gone too far. They found it difficult even to control themselves at this point. Lionel's eyes remained closed, his face the picture of serenity. In his mind, he had once again entered a world of white, a familiar balance standing before him. After everything, it had been perfectly balanced, no one side outweighing the other. He gazed upon it silently, going through all the memories it held once more. His body felt quite light and his mind felt extremely clear. His reflection on these memories made him feel as though he was right back there again, simulating that moment in real time without missing a single detail. The first day he met her, the first time he realized he liked her, the first time he confessed to her, the second time, the third visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience, the time they spent in the Joan Zone, their battle against Royal Blue Fort, his rage-fueled tirade against the puppet master. Those final moments of peace they had together at Varian Heart Mountain. The last time they shared a bed together. They were memories enough to move a man to tears. Somehow, though, to Lionel, it felt like he was watching the movie of someone else's life. He reached forward and touched the balance scale, his hand trailing down its frame before landing on the final object that had managed to keep it all even. It was a delicate, fragmented bracelet. It weighed almost nothing and was useless even to a third-dimensional existence. It was nothing more than a sentimental ornament, but it weighed so heavily. It was the final strand of hope that Lionel had been holding onto, so much so that his logical mind had given it more weight than even it was worth. Crack. With a light squeeze, Lionel crushed it to powder. He turned and walked away, the golden bronze balance crumbling into a pile of ash. In the real world, Lionel opened his eyes. A strong pressure seemed to roll out from him in waves, his mind suddenly feeling extraordinarily free. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience, he blinked, seeing the gazes of his brothers looking back at him. What are you all wrestling for? Take it easy on Milan and Arnold, they still need to fight in a few days. Lionel laughed lightly, his aura dispelling the tense atmosphere into the wind. Chapter 1165. Later that day, Lionel sat in silent meditation. He felt that everything about him was running smoother and faster than it ever had before. He could even feel his innate node far more clearly, so clearly, in fact, that he was shocked he hadn't sensed just how special it was before. His innate node wasn't just a source of a special force, it was more accurately the root of one. If Lionel had to describe it, he would say that an innate node was a step beyond a pure force crystal, maybe several steps, even. What this meant was that an innate node wasn't just a store of force, but it also carried with it the natural force arts one might expect to find in a pure force crystal. The difference was that an innate node's natural force arts were not only far more complete, they were far more layered and complex. Though Lionel had never laid eyes on a pure force crystal, at least not yet, he was absolutely certain of this. The depth of his innate force node was so vast that even he had a hard time believing it. He also came to understand that this was where the difference between himself and Elther lay. Elther had access to a force on the same level as Scarlet Star Force in chaotic particle force. The difference was that this was Elther's ability granting him this affinity, whereas Lionel's own was an innate node. Lionel had thought that there wasn't much of a difference originally, just a different road to the same destination. But, he realized now that there was a world of difference. Elther would never have access to the same depth of understanding Lionel could gain from his innate node. The world that opened up to Lionel was so large that he was having a hard time deciding where to start. Just to put matters into perspective, from only a cursory glance and look through, Lionel felt that he could build a visualization to aid his path through the fifth dimension, build a completely new magic system, comprehend derivative forces. The possibilities were endless. It felt like he had just been handed the blueprint of a vastly more advanced civilization, and now he could benefit by piecing together all of its mysteries. The change was so great that even Lionel was baffled for just a moment. In the past, he couldn't even send his internal sight near his innate node without it trying to destroy his mind. But, now, he didn't have to risk his mind at all. It was as though his innate node was directly speaking to him. Destruction. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel couldn't have expected that releasing his own baggage would open himself up in this way. It was like the weight of Aina had been a blockage. Or, maybe it was just the act of allowing those feelings to shatter that allowed Lionel to ascend his understanding to a new level. Fascinating, Lionel wondered, did Miguel have this same ability? Could he naturally feel what Lionel had? Or were there complications with the process? Lionel wasn't jealous, he was more so curious. Because if one innate node could bring him such benefits, what about another? He already had the little mink who could snatch abilities from others. He could use the silver tablet to wash away the personalities of those abilities to allow his people to absorb them without backlash. He had the tentacle womb, which he already had an evolution path for. If he also began to accumulate innate nodes as well, Lionel's gaze flickered. Maybe he didn't notice it, or maybe he did. But, he didn't even consider what it would take for him to accumulate these innate nodes. Lionel raised a palm, his force flickering and surging. After forming his seventh star, he realized that he had gained the ability to replenish his innate node faster. Unfortunately, this was a fairly useless ability since his body couldn't even withstand using his innate node to begin with. Let alone draining it, he couldn't even use a single % of it. However, now, Lionel realized that his innate node was no longer entirely useless to him either. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, the destructive aura that he had subtly grasped alone made his attacks far more potent than they had been in the past. And, now that his senses toward his innate node were even sharper, his destructive aura would only grow. There may very well come a time where Lionel would only have to touch something to make it crumble from the outside, in. His presence alone would cause things to disintegrate. Though the effect would be lesser than using Scarlet Star Force, it was a good replacement while he focused on getting his body stronger. The current Lionel sat outside, near the pool of the hotel. He was in full view of everyone around him, causing him to be the subject of quite a bit of scrutiny. However, no matter how many times they looked over at him, no one could find anything wrong. Is he really all right? Milan mumbled. The 8 of them, including Lionel's grandmother, were all furious. In fact, many of those who hadn't known the details previously were furious for Lionel as well. However, with the man himself acting as though nothing had happened, what were they supposed to do, exactly? You know Lionel, when he cuts something off, he doesn't even look back. Joel said lightly. Raj snorted. Good. It would be embarrassing if I had a harem and Leo didn't. This is the way it should be. He needs at least 3 wives and 12 concubines. I won't let him stop until he has at least that many. Our boy is about to have an elite fuckboy arc. The women of the group looked toward Raj with disdain, but they refrained from saying anything since it was clear that he was just sticking up for Lionel. However, Raj didn't seem ready to let it go. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, what are you all looking at? All you women are the same. How many men are you going to turn into the monsters you complain about before you realize that why you are the problem? Joyce suddenly snapped, her fists lighting with force. Are you trying to fight it out, you sack of shit? Oh my, I'm so scared. Raj rolled his eyes. Come bite me. I can't for the life of me imagine why you're called the fairer sex. You're all little demons in skimpy clothing. You ever think that maybe the reason you're all so attracted to the hard exterior of a man is because you're all just as hard on the inside? Come on, come fight me, then. At least in this kind of world you actually stand a chance. Joyce was so furious she couldn't even put her anger into words. Joel and the others felt a headache coming along. They knew the reason Raj was acting like this wasn't just related to Lionel. At that moment, though, Joel's brows suddenly furrowed, a message entering his ears. Joel immediately looked up to Lionel. He knew how sharp Lionel's senses were, there was no way he would miss such a thing. However, he didn't react in the slightest. It was either he was distracted by something, or he simply didn't care. Considering who it was, Joel had the feeling it was the latter. A few of you, come with me, Joel said lightly before going off. Visit. For a better user experience. You're tuning into the Carefree Valley YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.